I mean, I've talked about this before, that there does appear to be an orchestrated effort, an orchestrated campaign to drive a wedge between the Muslims and Africans, between the Arabs and the Africans, between Muslims and so-called black people. You see it on social media. So you're seeing more and more content now talking about, so-called Muslim colonization of Africa, Muslim imperialism and so forth in Africa and whatnot. Talking about the trans-Saharan slave trade and calling the trans-Saharan slave trade the Arab or the Muslim slave trade and so forth. Trying to portray it as if our history in Africa is similar to Western history or worse than Western history in Africa. And the reason is obvious. I mean, the reason is obvious. If you go by population, Africa is a Muslim continent by population. I mean, if Lebanon is a Muslim country, if Indonesia is a Muslim country, if we call these Muslim countries, then Africa is a Muslim continent. You understand? By population numbers. I mean, an honest census would show that more than half of all Africans are Muslim. And of course, you don't want Muslim cohesion. You don't want Muslim solidarity. You don't want Muslim unity. And obviously, this campaign to drive a wedge between the Muslims on the basis of skin color, so-called race, is a Western campaign because you hate Africans and you hate Muslims. You are racist. And for you, being African, being so-called black, exceeds being Muslim in terms of identity. So you see Africans as black rather than as Muslim, rather than even as Christian or anything else. You see them as black. They are and can only ever be what you think of them as. So this division actually makes sense to you, to Westerners. And you think that everyone else in the world must think of themselves according to the way that you think about them, right? Obviously, this is colonized thinking. I mean, it's colonizer thinking, and it is colonized thinking for any non-Westerner to think this way. They want you to believe that Muslim history in Africa is like their history or worse than their history, and that Muslims are racist like them. But notice who they're talking to. Notice who they're talking to, who they're targeting with this message. They're not targeting Muslims. We're not their target audience for that message because they know that message can't get anywhere with us. They know that won't get anywhere with us. So you have to look at this. You have to look at who's being aimed at before you even look at the content of the attack. That's the first move in trying to figure out what's really going on and who's behind it. Most people skip that part. They just get pulled straight into arguing over the content instead of asking the prior question, which is, why is this argument circulating now and aimed at this particular audience now, and who does that serve? I mean, no one's running content, no one's funding pages, no one has like bot networks set up to convince Muslims and Arabs that black Africans are their historical enemies. You understand me? They're not trying to incite racial hatred amongst Muslims. There's no Muslim Nick Fuentes or something. You understand? There's no manufactured Muslim influencer on the internet arguing that Africans have inferior IQs or what have you. That's not coming from us. There's no equivalent of white nationalist rhetoric being directed at the Muslims to try to stoke our supposedly latent hatred and racism. That effort doesn't exist. Ask yourself why. It doesn't exist because it wouldn't work. There is no reservoir of racial hostility in the Muslim world and the Arab world sitting there waiting to be tapped. No. There is nothing resembling the psychological terrain that you need to make a campaign like that land. See, you can't manufacture rage out of nothing, hatred out of nothing. Propaganda doesn't create feelings from a blank slate. It locates feelings that already exist and it redirects them or manipulates them. Like those white nationalist types, okay? You can have that in the West, you can have that in America because those racist, white supremacist sentiments exist. They never stopped existing. So you can have your Nick Fuentes types, you can have your alt-right types, right? Jordan Peterson, whatever, Douglas Murray, Sam Harris, and so forth, selling that same old racist rhetoric, that white supremacist rhetoric to so-called white people in the West. You can do that there because you're activating and you're stoking racial hatreds and hostility that's already there, that already exists. But that's not going to get anywhere among Muslims. Not Arab Muslims, not Asian Muslims, certainly not African Muslims. So the audience is the black diaspora and non-Muslim Africans, mostly Christians. Because, I mean, let's be honest, being Christian and African is very often a marker of having a colonized mentality. So that's the audience. That's the audience. That's who you're trying to convince that the Muslims were abhorrent and were monsters in Africa, that the Arabs were, that Muslims are racist and so forth. You have non-Muslims telling other non-Muslims how Muslims are because you can't successfully get Muslims to be the way that you're saying we are. So you have to remove us from the conversation. Do you understand what I'm saying? You know, usually when you want to stoke racial hatred, you'll do it by tapping into real existing bigotry in the community that you want to exhibit racism, right? You get them to say racist things. You get them to do racist things. Now they've proven how racist they are, because they actually are. That's how you create racial division. Again, like a Nick Fuentes or a Charlie Kirk. But there is no Muslim Nick Fuentes. There's no Muslim Charlie Kirk. There is no vein of racial hatred that you can tap into. So you bypass the ones that you want to behave badly, which is us, because we won't accommodate you with acting badly. And instead, you just go to the people that we supposedly hate and tell them behind our backs how bad we are, leaving us completely out of the conversation. Do you see how this works? You have to leave us out of the conversation. So, like I say, you take this message to so-called black people directly. You take it to them directly and tell them how bad we are. And there is a feeling that already exists in real and justified abundance in black and African communities. There's a real feeling, a rage at colonization, a rage at chattel slavery, resentment and anger, rage at 400 years of a system that was built brick by brick on the premise that an entire category of human being wasn't fully human. And then you have a whole system after that, ever since then, that still operates according to that same racist premise. So yes, the resentment and the anger that so-called black people feel, that Africans feel, black people in the West, that's real. It's justified, obviously. By any moral accounting, it's righteous anger. And precisely because it's real and because it's enormous, it's basically a kind of a fuel source, a flammable fuel source, sitting in the tank, in the hearts and minds of every so-called black person, every African, that can be inflamed and redirected if someone finds the right valve. You activate it and redirect it. See, I told you, rhetoric and propaganda can't create sentiments, but they can manipulate sentiments. They can activate and manipulate sentiments that already exist and redirect them. And centuries upon centuries of vicious abuse, dehumanization, violation, mistreatment, and oppression, oh yes, there's plenty of sentiment there to activate and manipulate and to redirect. The redirection takes that rage, which is rightfully aimed at the actual system that built itself on the backs of Africans, and transfers it against the Muslims and against the Arabs instead. You understand me? Because anyway, you're still, see, if you're a so-called black person, you're literally still under that same oppression as it is right now. The same exploitation, the same racist power structure that caused all that pain and anger in the first place. You're still under that. You're still stuck in that. You understand? So you can't be openly hostile to that. You can't openly fight against that. You can't openly hate that. You're under it. You're still stuck in that. You understand? So you can't be openly hostile to it. You're in it. You can't hate that openly. So you have no channel for your anger and justified resentment. But see, the power structure that you're under also hates us. It also hates Muslims. It hates Arabs. And it's allowed to hate Muslims and Arabs, to rage against us, to vilify us. It's a completely permissible channel for the expression of rage and anger, the rage and anger that was created by the power structure and by the society that you're trapped in. So you get this transference. It's a valve to redirect. Gives you an enemy that you can hate safely. You understand? Because your real enemy hates us. Your real enemy can tell you how terrible we are, how much worse we are, how we are monsters and so forth. And your enemy gives you away now. He opens a valve that lets you hate us instead of him cathartically. So it serves multiple purposes. Takes the heat off of him. It takes the heat off of Uncle Sam. It demonizes who he wants demonized. And it makes sure that you never align yourselves with us, which is exactly what you need to be doing, and which is exactly what your enemy is trying to prevent you from doing. Exactly what they're trying to prevent from happening. And also because of your experience, your actual lived experience with Westerners, your actual history with Westerners, it has also created a whole mentality that makes you think that anyone and everyone who is not so-called black probably hates black people. I mean, even the idea that there could possibly be people on Earth who do not think in these terms is completely inconceivable, especially if you're living in the West. So the propaganda not only activates and manipulates the justified anger, the pain, and the resentment, it also uses the negative assumptions that were learned through experience that makes you think that nobody has ever not thought about you the way the white racists think about you. You understand me? That everybody always has been unjust and has been racist and has been exploitative and dehumanizing to so-called black people and to Africans. So this means that you're already primed to believe when your enemy tells you that the Muslims are worse than they were. You're probably so, right? I mean, look at that first of all. Look at that first of all. They can't even try to win their case by making you believe that they're good. They know that's a losing battle already. They can't convince you that they're actually good. The best that they can possibly do is to try to make you believe that someone is worse than them. But no, the truth is no one is worse than them. No one has ever been. No one has ever been what they've been. No one has ever done the things that they've done. What they've been and what they still are. What they've done and what they're still doing. And this is exactly why they have to do this sort of thing. And you ought to know by now. You really ought to know by now. Your enemy is never going to point out someone and tell you that you're supposed to hate them without it being someone that you should probably love. Most likely. And if you don't know that by now, then you're still on a mental plantation. See, this is the whole operation. This is what it is, and this is what it's for. And it's not like an argument or a debate that's built on evidence. It's open to correction, open to argument or scrutiny. That's why we're exiled from the conversation. They don't want us in that conversation. It has to be a talk exclusively between you and your oppressor. You and your oppressor, like the waswasa of Shaitan. Uncle Sam whispering into your ear about how bad the Muslims were in Africa. Just don't let a Muslim into the chat. This has to be between you and me, and I'm a sincere advisor to you, said Uncle Sam. Said Iblis to mankind, and said Uncle Sam to black people. I'm your sincere advisor. I mean, don't worry, I will enter that chat, no problem. I'll enter that chat. But before we even get into the question of whether or not anything that they're saying is true, I mean, I just did a whole series on their tactics of dishonesty and deception, and you ought to know by now that you know they're lying because they spoke. You understand me? That's how you know. That's how you know. If they speak, they're lying, and if they're silent, they're not telling the truth. That's all. They're just not telling the truth, even when they're silent. You understand me? They lie when they speak, and when they don't speak, it's them not telling the truth. SubhanAllah. They can actually be dishonest verbally and dishonest mutely. But before I even get into the question, like I say, and I will get into it, the question of whether or not they're telling the truth about Muslims in Africa, you have to ask yourself, who benefits if what they say is believed? Who benefits if Africans and Muslims actually start treating each other as if they're historical enemies and not historical and natural allies? Not Africa. Africa doesn't benefit. The Muslim world doesn't benefit, if you believe that. I mean, every real material interest that both sides actually have is undermined by this. Talking about extraction, resisting extraction from foreigners, controlling your own resources, building regional financial and military power that doesn't go through Washington, that doesn't go through Paris or London or Brussels or Europe or what have you. No, every one of those interests is served by unity. Those interests is served by unity and cohesion. It's served by a continent that trusts its Muslim neighbors and by a Muslim world that trusts its African partners. That's a much bigger obstacle to outside extraction than either single bloc could ever achieve standing alone. You understand me? And look, there's nothing one way about this. There's nothing one-sided about this. It's not like the GCC, for example, gained their wealth and their influence off the backs of African labor or even off the back of African resources, minerals and whatnot. No. See, the Europeans came to Africa poor. They came to Africa poor. Yes, they did. Resource poor. And they got rich off of you. But everyone knows that's not the case today with the Arabs and the Muslims. I mean, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, their wealth was built on hydrocarbons pulled out of their own territory, or out of their own ground, their own sovereign ground. Not African labor, not African cotton, not African rubber or gold or diamonds. See, European wealth, they have a debt to Africa that's built into its foundation. Gulf wealth does not. When a Gulf state shows up in Africa today, they're not trying to get rich off of it. They're rich already. You understand me? They're looking for a partner. They're looking for a partner. And you can see what that different starting point actually produces on the ground right now. Like the UAE, for example, the Emirates, the Masdar, they've committed $10 billion to build 10 gigawatts of renewable power across sub-Saharan Africa by 2030, including a green hydrogen plant in Mauritania that gives that country a domestic industry that they never had before. You understand me? That's not a pipeline that's hauling out raw resources directly into Dubai. The UAE has pledged $1 billion towards AI infrastructure across the continent, across the whole continent of Africa, aimed at education, healthcare, and so forth. The Lagos Calabar Coastal Highway in Nigeria, that's a $1.13 billion project, and that's being built with financing from the Islamic Development Bank. That's a road that Nigeria owns, that Nigeria drives on. You understand? It's not some rail line that was built to only for the purpose of extracting goods to some colonial port. Saudi Arabia has put roughly, I think, $7 billion into power generation in Africa. Okay, yes, none of this is charity, and it shouldn't be. It's business. You understand? The Gulf states are also serving their own interests because, of course, they are. They're testing renewable energy technology at scale. They're securing energy partnerships in Africa. They're building trade relationships that are going to matter to them in their own long-term planning, continentally and regionally. And that's exactly the point. You understand me? Fair, respectful, decent trade and investment is supposed to work both ways. Mutual benefit. Africa gets power grids, they get highways, they get industries that they get to keep. And the Gulf and the GCC, they get a partner and they get a return on their investment. See, nobody has to pretend that either side is doing the other side a favor by doing business with each other. It's mutual interest. That's just what it looks like when two parties come together who each bring something to the table, actually trade with each other. You understand? It's like this. They actually trade with each other for mutual benefit instead of one side just existing to be stripped for the other's benefit, the way the West did and the way the West still does. See, both Africa and the Arab world and the Muslim world, they want to develop trade routes that don't need or that don't rely upon any Western intermediary. You understand? They want to have security arrangements between themselves that don't include any Western guarantor. Like you see Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, right? They have that mutual defense pact. And now Turkey is even talking about joining that. They're calling it the Islamic NATO. Well, don't you think it would be good for African nations to be part of that, to be included in that? See, Africa and the Muslim world, the Arab world, we need a capital that's going to circulate between Riyadh and Jakarta and Lagos without ever touching London, without ever touching New York. You understand me? That's the actual nightmare scenario for anyone whose position depends on Africa and the Muslim world staying separate and being suspicious of each other and being divided against each other. We've never been that way. We've never been that way. And they're trying to make us that way because it serves their interests and it's transparent. And you ought to be able to see it. Now, the only party that benefits from a rupture between Africa and the Muslim world is that same party that has spent the better part of 2 centuries extracting from both the Muslim world and from Africa separately. See, they would very much like to keep doing that separately, forever. You don't need me to tell you, or anyway, you shouldn't need me to tell you. You already know exactly who that is. You know exactly who that is because most of you anyway who are listening to me right now, you're living in his house. And you ought to understand his tactics by now. But before we get into the specifics of this particular operation to drive a wedge between Africa and the Muslims, I think it's worth establishing that manufacturing ethnic and religious division inside a colonized population or a targeted population is by no means a new tactic. You all know that. It's the single most reliable tool in the history of colonial administration. It's been documented extensively, admitted openly by the colonizers themselves in their own archives. And it has produced some of the worst atrocities of the last century. So we can't let ourselves fall for it. Don't let yourself fall for it. So you have to understand how they do. You have to understand the old version of this tactic so that it'll make it harder for them to run the new version on you because you recognize it immediately. So like, look at Rwanda, for example. Take Rwanda. Before Belgian colonization in Rwanda, Hutu and Tutsi were basically fluid social and economic categories inside a unified, cohesive Rwandan society. You could move between those categories through marriage, through cattle ownership and social status and so forth. The same way that a poor European back in the day might be able to make himself into a nobleman by acquiring land. You understand me? There was no rigid sort of racial wall between these two categories. The Belgians built that wall. Starting in the 1930s, the colonizers issued mandatory identity cards labeling every Rwandan as either Hutu or Tutsi or Twa, based on pseudo-scientific theories claiming that the Tutsi minority was a superior Hamitic race, distinct from and naturally suited for ruling over the Hutu majority. Understand? The Belgians then structured the entire colonial administration around this invented racial hierarchy, educating the Tutsis preferentially, appointing them to positions of power, excluding the Hutus from advancement, manufacturing exactly the resentment that the Belgian colonizers needed to keep both of the groups looking sideways at each other instead of looking at the colonizers. And then those ID cards outlived Belgian rule by decades. And when the genocide came in 1994, if you had the wrong category on your ID card, that could be a death sentence. See, the killers didn't invent the classification system, but they used it. And they believed it. That's what it looks like when you drive a wedge between people and you give it decades and decades to mature. See, you were supposed to be hating the Belgians, but you ended up hating each other according to the classification system that the Belgians imposed upon you. No, in over 1,000 years, Africans and Muslims, Africans and Arabs never hated each other. And we can't let them plant that poison seed in us now. Only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows how catastrophic that kind of a harvest would be for the generations to come. See, I talked before about the fact that the whole issue of race itself is a fabrication. so-called black and so-called white. These are fake classifications. But once you invent a difference and you start treating people according to that fake difference, well, then it becomes a real sociological reality. So like I said, there is no real existing sentiment of racial animosity between Muslims and Africans, between Arabs and Africans. But there is real animosity between Africans and Westerners, between Africans and so-called white people. And if that animosity gets redirected and becomes animosity towards the Muslims, becomes animosity towards the Arabs, then you have an inorganic, unnatural division that develops, and then those hostile sentiments will develop right alongside it. And then those hostile sentiments can be activated and manipulated. And I know we all know in abstract the idea of divide and conquer or divide and rule, but you have to understand the real mechanics of that, the reality of that. British colonizers in India did the same thing. They ran a version of that same sort of a thing. The same thing what the Belgians did with the Hutus and the Tutsis. They came up with this concept that they called the martial races, where they said that there are whole types of people that are supposedly have inborn military aptitude. And they controlled India partly by pitting one group, a favored group, against a disfavored group. And the French colonizers across West Africa and Central Africa, they ran versions of that same thing, elevating specific ethnic and religious groups into privileged colonizer roles, collaborator roles, precisely because doing so would guarantee that you had a whole class of local collaborators who were incentivized to defend the colonial order. And like now, if you have any doubt about how this fake division can become a real division, look at the whole narrative around Sudan and the Arabized and non-Arabized Sudanese, right? In Darfur, the RSF and the earlier iteration, the Janjaweed, that was always covered in the media as Arab Sudanese against African Sudanese. And you would have been forgiven for not even knowing that all of these people were Muslim. But this Arab versus non-Arab identity has actually become something real in Sudan, sociologically and politically. But it wasn't always that way. No. Before the British set foot in Sudan, you had sultanates. You had the Funj going back to the 1500s. You had Darfur running parallel to that, running their own territory. And they organized themselves around Islam. They organized around kinship. They organized around tribute, around who controls what land, right? That's it. Nobody's walking around with an Arab card or an African card, checking IDs at the border. Nobody cared about that. Okay? And the Funj, they were not Arab. They weren't even Muslim when they started. They converted to Islam and they picked up Arabic along the way. They picked it up later on. But the way that they ran their state, that was tribal. That was territorial. You paid tribute to the Sultan based on your dar, your designated slice of land. That's your dar, right? That's the whole system. There was no hierarchy of Arab over African. It was just a standard hierarchy of who's got power and who doesn't. It had nothing to do with ethnicity, it had nothing to do with language. And so in Darfur, that was even more the case. They didn't get built up by Nile Valley Arabs who migrated in. They got built up by West African Islamic networks, caravan routes, pilgrimage routes, right? People moving west to east on their way to Mecca. The language for the courts in Darfur was Fur, not Arabic, Fur. All the way up until 1916. Arab tribes didn't actually even show up in Darfur until the mid-1700s. Centuries after the Sultanate there was already set up and running. And when they got there, they were subjects. They weren't rulers. They didn't take over. When the Arabs came to Darfur, they didn't take over. I'm just telling you the history. They were subjects. But in 1898, the British come. The British arrive, and they start their divide and rule tactics. Because look, the way things were in Sudan and that territory, there were no categories. No one cared about so-called ethnicity. No one cared about so-called Arab or non-Arab. They cared if you were Muslim or not. They cared if you had land or not, if you controlled land or not, what your tribe was, how big your tribe was, and so on. But the colonizer strategy of indirect rule needs fixed categories. You need to be able to start saying that this one is such and such and that one is such and such. This category and that category and so on. And we like this group and we don't like that group. This group is better than that group and so forth. Never mind that you made up the groups in the first place and who belongs in them. You invented all of that. So this is what they did when the British came. And the Arabs in the Nile Valley, they got elevated, just like the Belgians did in Rwanda. And then the southern populations and the western populations got filed under the African label as different, distinct, separate, other, and they were treated accordingly. And because the British are so obsessed with so-called race, they made this hierarchy like it's biological instead of social or political, something that you're born into and can never leave. See, and then people get treated differently, and then that difference becomes real. Once the British put it into the census, now it becomes law, and now it's forever. Sudan gets that treatment. You take the absence of a divide, you manufacture a divide, and then you hand it out to everybody with their ID cards. Because you cannot govern a unified population as easily or as cheaply as you can govern one that's busy hating itself. So when you look at Darfur today, for example, at the so-called Arab Sudanese and African Sudanese, both Muslim, don't you dare pretend that that came out of Islam. Don't you dare pretend that that came out of Arabs or what have you. No. Don't even call it tribal. Don't pretend like this has been simmering for centuries and centuries. No, this is colonial machinery, and it just kept operating after the British left. So the truth be told, anytime a Sudani who thinks of himself as Arab and a Sudani who thinks of himself as not Arab or thinks of himself as African, anytime they fight each other, that's not an Arab fighting an African. That's the British fighting the Muslims, just getting you to do it. You understand me? I'm telling you this so that you can better understand the version that they're running on you right now, so that you can see the pattern. Because this is not speculation. I'm not saying this isn't what it's not just me saying this. This is the colonial record itself, the administrative record itself. They taught it in their universities, in the universities of the countries that came up with those policies and ran those policies. The men who designed those policies, they wrote memos, they gave speeches, they were proud of what they did. They were proud of how efficient it was. No, divide and rule isn't a conspiracy theory. It's documented. It's standard issue colonial management. That's their technique. That's how they do. And they're doing it right now. So the only question worth asking when you see any modern instance of this sudden manufactured ethnic or religious suspicion is, does it fit that pattern? And when you're talking about them trying to rewrite Muslim history, it definitely fits that pattern. This is some colonizer mischief, I'm telling you, and anyone should be able to see it if you're familiar with how they are and what they do. So you want to treat Africans who speak Arabic or who speak any language deeply influenced by Arabic, like Somali, for example. You want to treat them like they're foreigners on the continent. Like they aren't just as African as anyone else whose entire bloodline has never lived on anything but African soil. Nobody applies that same treatment or that same judgment to English-speaking Nigerians or French-speaking Ivorians, right? Nobody suggests that they're somehow not African by speaking English or by speaking French, but speak Arabic and suddenly you're alien. Speak Arabic and suddenly you're not really African. It's a sorting mechanism. You understand me? It's a sorting mechanism, purpose-built to manufacture a fake category of Arabized African who can then be treated as if he is an intruder or he is an invader in his own homeland. When the truth is actually just that he's African, full stop. As African as anyone else on the continent whose ancestors never lived anywhere else. Like I say, you can see this exact mechanism at work in how the Western media covers the Sudan conflict, or even the wider Sahel region. They routinely frame violence in explicitly Arab and African or Arab versus African terms, as if Arabic-speaking Sudanese are not Africans, as if the conflict is a foreign incursion, rather than what it actually is in the overwhelming majority of cases, which is an internal African political and resource conflict between African actors over African land and over African power. And that all gets relabeled along invented racial lines for outside consumption. You understand me? I'm telling you, you have to watch what they do. You have to watch how they do. You have to pay attention, because they're always going to try to trick you out of ever being able to understand anything. They don't want you to ever be able to understand anything. They'll relabel Africans as Arabs, when nobody in their whole family tree ever came from anywhere but Africa. See, they'll have you thinking that African Muslims aren't really Africans. See, that's the wedge that I'm talking about. That's the wedge condensed into a single word choice. If you repeat that over and over again, then it starts to sound like it starts to feel like it's a neutral description, rather than what it actually is, which is a very deliberate framing decision. A framing decision made by people with an interest in the framing. Look how they do with the Sahel. Look how they do with the Sahel, the countries that kicked out the French. Ibrahim Traoré, maybe the most admired and respected leader in Africa today, maybe in the world. When's the last time you heard those countries or their leaders being referred to as Muslims? No. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, these are overwhelmingly Muslim countries. Burkina Faso's population is roughly, I think, 2/3 Muslim. Mali and Niger is well over 90% Muslim. These are Muslim countries. Ibrahim Traoré is a practicing Muslim, alhamdulillah. He's that country's first Muslim head of state since the 1960s. We've seen him performing at Taraweeh. We know he's a Muslim, he's a practicing Muslim. But he doesn't fit your stereotype. He calls for respect between the country's Muslim majority and the Christian minority. And he said that anyone who tries to divide the citizens along religious lines is going to go to jail. They're going to go to prison. That's a Muslim leader. But you don't want to call him that. Traore is almost never described as a Muslim leader. Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Senegal, these are almost never described as Muslim countries, even though that is a more accurate and more relevant description of their populations than most of the labels that do get used. They're described as African countries, which sure, they are African countries, but you want to emphasize that over them being Muslim. You say they're Sahel countries, they're military coup, military junta countries, anti-French countries. Every label, except the one that happens to be true of the overwhelming majority of the people who live there. You understand me? But see, you need them to not be viewed as Muslim countries. You need them to be African and not Muslim in the minds of the people. Because look, watch where the word Muslim actually does show up in their coverage of the region, of the Sahel. It shows up only when they talk about the terrorist groups, the jihadi groups, the Al-Qaeda linked fighting groups and whatnot, the militants, the Islamic State fighters, Daesh and so forth, the various militant factions that are burning African villages, attacking African soldiers. That's the only place religion ever enters into the story at all, into the coverage. Never mind that they are African Muslim villages and African Muslim soldiers who are getting killed and attacked by those terrorists. See what they build in an uninformed mind, the mind of a reader or a listener or a viewer, an audience, what have you. On one side, Muslims, and that label is reserved for the terrorists and the extremists. And on the other side, Africans. That's the government. That's the populations that are fighting to survive against those terrorist attacks. See? Someone paying just half attention is going to walk away with the impression that this is, again, Muslims versus Africans, when the actual truth is the flat opposite of that framing. This is an African Muslim government defending African Muslim populations against a very violent minority who happens to claim Islam as their religion as the justification for their violence. Erasing that fact from one side of the sentence and keeping it attached to the other side of the sentence, that doesn't just distort the picture, it manufactures a completely backwards picture. See? You want to say Africans kicked out the French, and the Muslims are attacking those Africans who kicked out the French. No, Muslims kicked out the French, and now those Muslims who kicked out the French are being attacked by rabid extremists who most likely have French backing. Oh, they're trying to drive a wedge. Watch what gets left out of history when it gets taught in the West and increasingly in Africa itself, in any African country where Western curriculum and Western media framing still sets the terms. They don't teach you about Mansa Musa, for example, an indigenous African Muslim ruler who was literally, subhanAllah, wealthy enough to affect the price of gold in another region's economy because of how much charity he gave away. Nobody teaches about the indigenous African Muslim Sokoto Khilafah and compares it with or contrasts it with, say, for example, the Berlin Conference, when you want to talk about so-called Muslim colonization, so-called Muslim imperialism, so that you can actually see who built things and who subjugated people and who extracted. Because, of course, they don't want to teach you that. They don't want to talk about that. Like I said, they don't want us actually in the conversation. Because you can't lie like that in a conversation that we're part of. You understand me? You can't drive a wedge between us if we're allowed to speak. No, you're letting the wrong people get excluded from this conversation, I'm telling you. SubhanAllah, I don't even know how Westerners can even get hold of your ear at this point. When did they ever tell you anything that was true? When have they ever told you anything that was true? When did they ever give you good advice? When have they ever demonstrated, ever, that they're looking out for your best interests and they care about your welfare? But see, they made a mistake. They made a mistake. See, they're trying to transfer your justified anger and your resentment from your enemy to your friend. But they picked the wrong friend to do that to. They picked the wrong friend to do that to. See, they're trying to lie to you about the Muslims, as if we're going to let ourselves be lied about to you. No, we're not going to let that slide. We're not going to let that slide. I mean, yes, sure, you lie about us all the time. You lie about us all the time. But most of the time, you're lying about us to people who are already not our friends. You're lying about us to people who already hate us. You're lying about us to people who are already hostile to us. Means who cares? Who cares? You lie about us to Americans? Who cares? You lie about us to Europeans? Who cares? You tell lies to each other about us, colonizer to colonizer. Who cares? For what possible reason would we care to correct you? You're lying to people about us who have never dealt with us in good faith anyway, who have never approached us in good faith anyway, who have never approached us anyway as anything but enemies. So no one actually cares what lies those people want to believe. But now you're lying about us to our friends. You're lying about us to our brothers and sisters in Africa, and that's a mistake. Because we can put our record, we can put the record of our history in Africa, we can put our record up against your record all day long. No, you don't really want to go item by item with us on this account. Not on colonization, not on racism, not on slavery, not on anything. No, we have nothing whatsoever to fear in going through Muslim history in Africa. All you're doing actually is giving us an opportunity to showcase the superiority of our civilization over yours, of our principles over yours, our values over yours, and how that has practically manifested throughout the history of Muslims in Africa and everywhere else. I mean, I've talked about it before, Muslims in Africa, but if you really want to get into it, well, by all means, let's get into it. So you want to talk about the spread of Islam in Africa? We can talk about it. You want to talk about the trans-Saharan slave trade? We can talk about it. You're doing us a favor. You're not doing anything but asking for a humbling of your own self. Okay, so if we're going to talk about Africa, Muslims in Africa, Islam in Africa, and the history there, we need to approach this properly, in context. You understand, Muslims we always operate, alhamdulillah, according to our own frameworks. We just do, even unconsciously. I mean, we can perform your frameworks. We can use your frameworks when we talk to you, when we talk to Westerners, because we know that's the limits of your cognitive range, you understand? We can use your way of talking. We can use your way of approaching things. And sometimes we can even fool ourselves into thinking that your frameworks are our frameworks just because we're so good at performing them when we talk to you. But the truth of the matter is that Muslims, alhamdulillah, by and large, and throughout our history, we have operated in the world according to our frameworks. We always have. And these frameworks are much more comprehensive and much deeper than what you're used to. Like, we don't just look at, this happened and that happened. We look at the whole 360-degree view. You understand me? The before and after. We understand events, any given event, within a continuum of experience, a continuum of history. What you people call a deep dive or going down the rabbit hole or whatever you want to call it, okay, that's our normal method of considering things, of understanding things. It's not a deep dive for us. This is just our basic approach to understanding issues. You skip rocks on the surface of the water, but we scuba dive. So the history of Islam in Africa, the connection between us and Africa goes very, very, very far back, very far back. And that connection is thoroughly interwoven in our history. The go-to reference that people usually use is the Sahabi Bilal, radiallahu anhu, who was Abyssinian, Ethiopian, and was from among the most honored and beloved converts, early converts to Islam. But that's just a very surface level point that you can make. I mean, there are numerous so-called black Sahaba, like the woman who raised Rasulullah ﷺ after his mother died, Ayman. She was an African woman. And she was beloved and honored by Rasulullah ﷺ all her life. And her son, Osama bin Zayd, again, one of our most beloved and most admired figures in Islamic history, the son of a African woman. But you need to go even deeper than that, because the connection is deeper than that. It really is. You literally cannot discuss Islam. You can't discuss the Muslims. You can't discuss Rasulullah ﷺ or even the Arabs without talking about Africa. Ibrahim's son, Ismail, the father of the Arabs, the ancestor through whom the Prophet ﷺ, his own lineage traces back, he was born to Hajar, who was Egyptian, an African woman. Some historians, including At-Tabari, say specifically that she was Nubian. So in fact, the mother of the Arab nation itself was African. You understand me? That's the foundation. Every Arab who traces their lineage through Ismail, alayhi salam, goes back to an African woman, including Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the Prophet himself made sure that nobody forgot it. You understand me? He told his companions, he told the Sahaba directly, one day you will open Egypt, right? I mean, first of all, that's a documented prophecy that no one would have had any reason to believe at the time when he said it. When Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said it, there was no reason to believe that that was going to come true. But of course, it did happen. It did come true. And he said, when you open that land, treat its people kindly, for they have a right of kinship upon you. Kinship. Now, scholars have always read that kinship in at least one of two different ways, or in both, two different ways. One is that there's a tie of kinship through Hajar, the mother of Ismail, who's the father of the Arabs. Then the other is about Maria al-Qabtiyya, the Egyptian slave who was given to Rasulullah ﷺ by the Maqawqis of Egypt, and who bore him his son, Ibrahim. So you have blood and marriage, and you have lineage running straight through Egypt, Africa, right? all invoked by the Prophet ﷺ himself as a reason for permanent honor and protection and respect and dignity and kind treatment towards Africa and Africans. This is an explicit command from Rasulullah ﷺ. This is foundational. So yes, Africa's relationship and Islam's relationship with Africa predates even the Rasulullah ﷺ and goes all the way back to the origin of the Arabs themselves, and back to Hajar, back to Ibrahim, back to Ismail alayhi salam. You know, the running between Safa and Marwa on Hajj, that's a commemoration of the acts of an African woman, the actions of an African woman, the wife of Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam, the mother of Ismail, the mother of the Arabs, Hajar. Over 2 million Muslims just this year honored her this year at the Hajj when they performed the rite of Safa and Marwa, the running between Safa and Marwa. You understand? And everybody knows what that act commemorates. When Hajar was running back and forth looking for water. Everybody knows what it commemorates. Everybody knows who it commemorates. And of course, obviously, everyone knows about the first hijrah, right? I mean, when the Muslims, the early Muslims, the first Muslims, needed refuge before they even made the hijrah to Medina, the first hijrah in the 5th year of Islam, when the persecution in Mecca became too unbearable, Rasulullah ﷺ, he didn't send those vulnerable Muslims to the east or to the north or anywhere in the Arabian interior. He sent them south, across the Red Sea into Abyssinia, to Africa, what's now Ethiopia, to the court of the then Christian king Najashi, on the strength of nothing but his reputation as for being a just ruler who doesn't do wrong to anyone. And when the Quraysh sent their envoys to try to get the king to turn over the Muslims to him, he listened to Ja'far bin Abi Talib reciting the words from the Quran about Maryam and Isa alayhi salam, and he wept. And he gave them sanctuary, and he refused to turn them back over. You understand? So the first sanctuary that Islam ever knew, that the Muslims ever knew, the place that kept the earliest Muslims safe and kept them alive when the kuffar of Mecca wanted them dead, was on African soil under an African king's protection. And Najashi accepted Islam. He converted. The first head of state, in fact, the first ruler to embrace Islam was an African ruler in history. So you need to understand, the Muslims in Africa, this isn't like the Europeans in Africa. You understand me? Africa is not a place that Islam eventually reached, or that the Muslims suddenly became aware of, or they suddenly came to Africa out of nowhere. No, Africa is woven into the identity even of the Prophet's own bloodline, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and into his explicit instructions to the Sahaba, to the Muslims. And the survival of the earliest Muslim community, Muslim refugees, before Islam had spread anywhere at all, was granted to us in Africa. So whatever the Westerners, you know, the Westerners who want to drive a wedge between the Muslims in Africa, between Africans and Arabs, between Muslims and so-called black people in the diaspora or wherever else, whatever they want people to believe about Muslims and Africa being what, alien peoples to one another or hostile to one another or so on, the actual root of the story proves the complete opposite. We were never separate. We were never alien to each other. We were never hostile to each other. We're kin. And our Prophet ﷺ told us that we're kin, and he told us to honor that kinship, and we did, alhamdulillah. Now don't come talking to me about some Arab guy who owns the corner shop in your neighborhood and he was rude to you, right? Some Muslim, this Muslim or that Muslim did something or said something racist or what have you, right? Like some individual experience is going to nullify the totality of our history and what our deen teaches us and what we have always manifested on a civilizational scale on this matter. That's dishonest. That's dishonest. That's like saying that a university, that's like you saying that a university does not teach advanced mathematics or something because you happen to meet a graduate who graduated from that university who himself personally can't do math. You understand me? You're not saying anything except that one singular person has a problem. That's what you're saying. But like I say, in reality, civilizationally, theologically, and historically, no one honest can possibly say that the Muslims and that the Arabs were ever anything like the Westerners in Africa. They were not predatory like them. They were not violent like them. They were not racist like them. They were not extractive like them. They were not brutal like them. And that's just a fact. You can like it or not like it. No, our history in Africa is exactly what they don't want you to know about because it demonstrates everything criminal and everything contemptible about their history in Africa. You understand me? Like I talked about before, there was never anything remotely like colonization in Africa by the Muslims. Not anything remotely like Western colonization, not even remotely close. I mean, I talked about it before, but we're talking about Africa now. We can get more into it. That's fine. Because like I said, the West is running an orchestrated and a very deliberate campaign of disinformation, deception, And they're trying to drive a wedge between us. And also, like I said, half of Africa is Muslim. So you're trying to drive a wedge. If you're trying to drive a wedge between us and Africa, you're trying to drive a wedge between the Ummah. You're trying to divide the Ummah. And obviously, we're not going to let you do that. We're not going to let you do that. So yes, we can talk about the spread of Islam in Africa. We can talk about the trans-Saharan slave trade. We can talk about Muslim and Arab relations with Africa and in Africa before, in history, and now. And we can do that without any reservations. We can do that without any hedging, without any obfuscation whatsoever, but with pure objectivity and unbiased testimony. Absolutely, yes, we can. You understand? I'm not here to deliver spin or rhetoric. It's not like, because I'm a Muslim, and therefore I want to make Islam and I want to make Muslims look good. No, I don't have to do anything to make Islam look good or to make Muslims look good. That's why I became Muslim in the first place. You understand me? Because Islam stands up to scrutiny. It stands up to scrutiny better than any other belief system, better than any other civilization, better than any other religion. And the Muslims, alhamdulillah, stand up to scrutiny better than any other nation. That's a fact. And part of why that is because we do not gloss over anything, and because we genuinely prioritize accuracy and honesty, telling the truth, even if the truth includes acknowledging mistakes or wrongdoing that we ourselves might have done. You understand me? And because we are like that, because we believe in that, because we believe in accountability, we believe in accountability first to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and then to the historical record. That's something that matters to us. Because of that, you will find that the instances of our mistakes and our wrongdoing are fewer than any other nation in history, alhamdulillah. Because we do not believe in compounding our wrongs. If we've done wrong, we don't believe in compounding our wrongs or compounding our mistakes by now lying about them. So no, we're not perfect. We weren't perfect and we're not perfect, and we never said that we were. No one's here saying we're perfect. And again, that's another tactic of dishonesty and deception that we talked about before. You always jump to that. Oh, you're talking about how bad the West is, how bad the West has been, all the terrible things that the West has done. So I guess that means the Muslims are perfect, right? You're saying that you all are perfect? No, that's a tactic. You're just doing a tactic. I didn't say we're perfect. I said we're better than you, because it's a fact. And if you're afraid to make the distinction between what's better from what's worse, well, I don't know how you expect to ever improve in anything. SubhanAllah. So I'll go through it, no problem. I'll go through all their talking points, all the talking points of this divisive campaign that's trying to alienate us from our brothers and sisters, our kin in Africa. And that's trying to give a false picture to non-Muslim so-called black people in Africa and in the diaspora, the black diaspora. But like I say, you're going to have to be patient. You're going to have to be patient because we use our own frameworks and we use our own approach. And I know some of you are not going to have the attention span for it. I mean, it's normal in the Muslim world. If you don't know, it's normal in the Muslim world, in Muslim media, for a single topic to be a 3-hour conversation. I don't mean some Joe Rogan style, 3-hour meandering gibberish jumping from this to that. I mean a sustained, focused conversation about one single thing. That can go on for hours because we are not superficial people. So first of all, when you talk about Islam spreading in Africa, right, you need to define what you're talking about here. Are you talking about belief in Islam spreading? Or are you talking about Muslims migrating into Africa and living in Africa? Or are you talking about Muslims establishing governance over the lands in Africa? Because these are all three different things, and they all have three different stories. I already talked about the fact that Islam spread in Africa, just like it did anywhere else in terms of the religion, in terms of the faith. It spread very, very gradually over the course of centuries. Again, that's just a historical fact. And it's regardless of whether or not there was a Muslim government over any particular land. That had no bearing on it. Muslim rulership never translated to population conversion. Population conversion usually went the other way. Population conversion led to Muslim rulership, not the other way around. You understand? People didn't become Muslim because the government was Islamic and made people or coerced people to become Muslims. Rather, governments became Muslim governments because the people themselves had converted, and then rulership just followed organically. That was the case across most of the Muslim world. Most of the Muslim world, and across Africa, most of Africa. And again, this is because we take the religion seriously, because we operate within that framework, like I said at the beginning. So it's a foundational principle in Islam. It's a foundational principle. This isn't just a talking point for an argument. It's in the Quran itself. There's no compulsion in religion. No compulsion in religion. The Quran states it unequivocally. in one of the most repeated and one of the most binding ayahs of the Quran. You understand me? I'm not retrofitting this into the historical record to make the historical record look good. No, this is the actual instruction that shaped how Islam and how Muslims moved around the world, including in Africa, how Muslims dealt with other people and how Muslims dealt with other nations. So Islam reached most of Africa, West Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, overwhelmingly through trade, not conquest. Merchants crossed the Sahara carrying gold, textiles, books, salt, whatever. And scholars followed them. Religious people followed them, accompanied them. This isn't missionaries, by the way. I'm not talking about missionaries. No, that's our scholars and our religious people going primarily to attend to the needs of communities that developed as a result of trade and interaction. In other words, they were going there for people who were Muslim already. They weren't going there to make da'wah. They weren't going there to proselytize. You understand? People encountered Islam through contact and through the example of Muslim traders who were honest in their dealings and they were fair with people. So they encountered Islam through that and through intermarriage. See, we're talking about the very slow accumulation of exposure to Islam and interest in Islam over the course of time, over generations. Not through some army invading and converting people at the point of a sword. Because Muslims, again, as a civilizational collective nation, follow Islam and operate according to Islam and those frameworks. Understand me, again, I'm not retrofitting the prohibition of coercion onto the historical record. I am telling you what the historical record actually is, and I'm telling you why it is what it is. Like I said last time, Egypt was not a Muslim majority country until centuries after the Muslims were already running it. Centuries. You understand? Egypt was under the Muslims, without the population becoming majority Muslim, for twice as long or 3 times as long as the British were in India, or as the British or the colonizers were in Africa, converting people to Christianity by force and by bribery and by extortion. Let me say that again. Muslims were in control of Egypt, right? They were the government of Egypt for at least 300 years before the population of Egypt eventually became a Muslim majority. Means no compulsion. Meanwhile, if you just look at the period that they call the scramble for Africa, this period of colonization and missionaries and whatnot on the continent of Africa, from the 1900s, from 1900 to the 1960s. So from when they really went in hard with the colonization and the conversion to the point when most of the African countries gained their independence. You went from around 10 million Christians in 1900 to 60 million Christians in 1960. In 60 years, 1 million a year. Because under the British, under the French, under the German, under the Portuguese colonizers, if you want to go to school, become Christian. If you want a job, become Christian. If you want to go to the doctor, you want to go to the hospital, well, become Christian. If you want to eat, become Christian. If you don't want to get shot, become Christian. Yes. You want to talk about compulsion? You want to talk about forced conversion? That's your history. That's your history in Africa, not our history in Africa. You were locking up Namibians, the Germans, in concentration camps, and then giving them Bible lessons. You understand me? Meanwhile, if you were a non-Muslim living under Muslim rule, your access to education, to healthcare, to food, to shelter, security, basic needs, basic rights, you had it. You had all that. It was not contingent upon you becoming a Muslim. It was not based on you being a Muslim. You understand me? We provided that not because you were Muslim, but because we are Muslim. And that's what we do. When you all went to Africa or you went to India or anywhere else, you used basic level decency, basic level provision, basic level sustenance, basic level human decency and kindness as leverage. You made conversion the only way to get access to sustenance or education or opportunity. And yes, literally sometimes it was the only way that you could even save your neck. That's what you did. That's what you did. See how nice the Christians are? See how kind, see how generous? They build schools, they build hospitals, they build orphanages and clinics and food centers and what have you. And all you have to do is become a Christian to get access. Aren't they kind? Aren't they compassionate? Don't you want to eat? You understand? You withheld from people in order to blackmail them into becoming Christian. While we provided to people, no matter what religion they followed, because we were following our religion. And that's what Islam teaches us. Again, these are just the facts. You're free to check on it. This is just the truth. In a lot of the lands in Africa, you had African kings converting first. They would convert first, often after years of exposure to Islam through, again, trade relationships. And then their populations would follow gradually afterwards, sometimes over a century or more, generations, right? With the older beliefs, still coexisting right alongside Islam for generations. This happened all over the place. This is not the profile of an imposed religion. This is the profile of a religion that the people themselves, over time, actually just chose on their own, of their own volition. Now again, compare that to how conversion happened in the colonial context, the Western colonial context, when your missionaries arrived alongside the soldiers, in front of them or behind them, when the colonial administrators would come to the people and give them treaties written in languages that they couldn't understand. And your missionaries came in, they came walking in the wake of like land seizures, carrying a picture of a so-called God that just so happened to look exactly like them. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. No, the historical record simply does not show any institutionally backed forced conversion to Islam anywhere on the continent, and that's just the truth. What it shows instead, over and over, is conversion following peaceful interaction, usually again through trade, and that trade led to interest in Islam, because the traders themselves were so upright and fair and pious in their dealings. That's not just me saying. This is literally the documented pattern over and over again across Africa and across most of Asia, places like Indonesia and Malaysia. No, stop lying about forced conversion or colonization, Islam spreading by coercion and compulsion and so forth. Islam was never a colonizing religion. Africans embraced Islam on their own, whether there was a Muslim ruler or not, whether it was Muslim government or not. No, Africans made their own choice by their own intelligence. You know, West African Muslims, or many African Muslims in fact, developed their own systems for writing coming out of the Arabic language, the Arabic script, Hausa and Mandinka and so forth, the Arabic script they used. And they produced entire bodies of indigenous literature, poetry, religious scholarship, and so forth, in their own tongues, for their own communities. You understand? The Malays did the same, the Indonesians did the same. They came up with the Jawi script. Turkish language was in the Arabic letters. Somali language was in the Arabic letters. You understand? I'm not saying they were using Arabic language, but Arabic letters. Means they kept their language. You understand? They enriched their own languages. Nobody had to give up their language. That's not what a conquered or intellectually colonized people does. That's what a population does when it has taken Islam willingly, by choice, and they've taken what you can call the tools that came with Islam, like the Arabic language, and they made it fully their own, by their own initiative and for their own purposes and for their own people. I mean, yes, of course, the Arabic language itself spread as well. Of course it did, but not by force, by convenience, by utility, because that was the language of business. That was the language of trade. That was the language of academia and scholarship and so forth. And you know that this is how it spread. You know that it spread by convenience and by utility, not that it was some institutionally, colonizer imposed strategy of cultural erasure. You know that that's not how it did, and that it was by convenience. When you just compare the Arabic that's spoken in Morocco to the Arabic that's spoken in Mecca, subhanAllah, it's almost not even the same language, honestly. Now compare the English that's spoken in, say, Bombay or spoken in Lagos, and compare that to the English that's spoken in the UK. It's the same. I mean, it's not only the same, it's not just the same, it's anachronistic to the colonial period. You understand? You hear them using very antiquated phraseology, turns of phrase, as like they sound like they're coming out of the 1910s or something. Scallywag, rapscallion, pip pip, jolly good, cheerio, what have you. Their English is a colonial time capsule when you hear them speak. But you won't find any uniformity of dialect in the Arabic language across the whole Muslim world. The Egyptians talk one kind of Arabic, the Syrians talk another kind, the Algerians a whole other kind, the Khalijis another kind. You understand? And if you find a non-Arab Muslim speaking Fusha Arabic, classical Arabic, formal Arabic, and he comes from a Muslim country, he's only speaking that because no one in his country speaks Arabic, and he learned Arabic by studying the Quran. And again, you talk about cultural erasure. This is something that comes with colonization, cultural erasure. Well, look across the Muslim world. How do we dress? Just in Africa. Just look about Africa. Talk about Africa. Where's the Arabic uniform? Because I can see the Western uniform. It looks like what I'm wearing right now, suit and tie. And I'm wearing it because that's the culture that I actually come from. That's my actual lineage. That's my actual history. You understand? No one has to dress Arab. No one has to dress Arab. No one has ever had to dress Arab. This was never something imposed. I mean, like I say, look across Africa. And again, you can look across the broader Muslim world. Everywhere and everyone, they have their own traditional clothes, their own traditional outfits. See, it's actually so diverse and so not uniform that you don't even know actually what Arab dress even actually is. You don't even know. You don't even know what the Arabs used to wear during the times that Islam was spreading in Africa. But we know what the Western colonizers wore, don't we? Because that's what they're wearing. That's what certainly most of the African Christians are wearing, by and large. We know the colonizer uniform. No, Muslim Africans wear their own style of dress, from Maghreb to Eritrea, from Senegal to Egypt. No cultural erasure, no colonizer uniform. The same way that Malays, like I say, have their own traditional dress, Pakistanis have their own traditional dress, and the same reason that I wear what I wear, my traditional dress. You understand? Because Muslims never dictated that your culture and your customs have to be Arab culture and customs or what have you. We have rules about clothes that what they need to cover. That's basically all that matters. That you're not exposed, and that you're not like dressed in a priest outfit or something, a uniform of a priest, something like this, anything that makes you conspicuously appear to belong to another religion. So again, Westerners, you forced people and coerced people to become Christian, to join your church. You replaced their language. You replaced their style of dress. You dictated uniformity and conformity with colonizer culture on every front. We never did that. And again, why? Why did we not do that? Because we have a system of law. We have a system of jurisprudence extracted from the Quran and Sunnah that tells us not to do that. To respect other people's ways, respect other people's cultures, respect other people's customs. Do you see the spread of Islam and the spread of Muslims across Africa and across the world operated in accordance with the teachings of Islam itself? Like if you knew about Islam, if you know about Islam, but you don't know about history, and you had to speculate about how the spread of Islam might look, how it would go, how it would be done, and you had to speculate about that based exclusively and only upon what you knew from the Quran and Sunnah, well, you would say that the spread of Islam would probably go exactly like how it did go. That it would happen exactly like how it did happen. And now, when you can actually look at the historical record and see objectively how it did in fact proceed, how Islam actually did spread, you can see that it did in fact proceed according to the teachings of the religion. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. And once the people became Muslim, khalas, they were Muslim. That's it. They're Muslim. They're part of the Ummah now, just like anybody else. I'm talking about everywhere. But it's the same in Africa. No different. African Muslims were never treated as lesser, never treated as separate, never treated as like a peripheral branch of the Muslim Ummah. Never. They were never set apart by so-called ethnicity or so-called race or color or what have you. The only thing that ever separated any Muslim community, say from Timbuktu or Kanu or wherever, that separated them from the Muslims of Damascus or Cairo was geography, just the physical distance. The distance that a pilgrim had to travel to go to Mecca or what have you. Never ethnicity, never so-called race, never color, never a theological judgment about who counted as a full member of the Ummah, right? Never anything like that. Never some religious rationale for treating human beings as cursed or as subhuman or as divinely designated as slaves like how the Christians did with their fabricated curse of Ham blasphemy. Like when Mansa Musa went to Cairo on his way to Mecca for Hajj in 1324, he wasn't treated like a curiosity, like some exotic, inferior, some alien from an inferior corner of the Muslim world. Absolutely not. He was received with honor, and he's remembered by the Egyptian chroniclers who were writing at that time as a noble Muslim sovereign. You understand me? As a fellow Muslim ruler with immense piety and immense dignity and respect. Obviously immense wealth as well. And he got the same protocols that any other head of state would have gotten who was on their way to Hajj. Now I'll tell you about something. This will let you know, inshallah, that I'm not just here trying to spin. I'm not trying to obfuscate or just try to make the Muslims look good. There was an invasion by Morocco against the Songhai Empire in the late 1500s for the control of the gold trade routes. This was about Morocco trying to gain wealth and trying to gain influence and trying to gain prestige as an independent power from the Ottomans. Sultan Ahmed al-Mansur, his own religious scholars told him to his face, this war is haram. You can't do this. You cannot wage war against a fellow Muslim nation like the Songhai for a reason like this. But he overruled them. He did it anyway. So the Sultan's own court, the Sultan's own scholars and muftis told him not to do it, and he did it regardless because he wanted control of the gold, the gold routes. Nobody regarded the Songhai as inferior or as foreign or as alien or as somehow naturally eligible for conquest because they were black, because they were African. No one framed it that way then, and it shouldn't be read that way now. It should be looked at exactly as what it was. Just one Muslim power going up against another Muslim power over control over a trade route. That's all it was. And you can find this, so many stories like that across history, from the Ottomans to the rival sultanates in the Indian subcontinent, conflicts between different Arab dynasties, fighting with other Arab dynasties. for the exact same reasons. Just geopolitics, territory, wealth, privilege, power consolidation. One power wants to consolidate their power or expand their sphere of influence and so forth. This is normal politics, normal geopolitics. It was never about some ideology of superior and inferior, and it was never even about Arab or African. It's geopolitics and opportunism. It wasn't even about extraction or subjugation. It wasn't colonization. It wasn't about supremacy. Just rival powers occupying two different ends of the same trade route, the most important trade route. Literally a conflict between two powers that regarded each other as powers with respect. Now, why I'm talking about this is because in the course of that conflict, after the Moroccans won, there was a scholar in Songhai, a Songhai scholar in Timbuktu, in what's now Mali, indigenous African Muslim scholar named Ahmed Baba. He was one of, if not the most preeminent Islamic legal scholars in West Africa. And he was in opposition to the Moroccan government, to the Moroccan Sultan. And he was arrested over that, and he was brought to Marrakesh as a political prisoner. Okay? Ahmed Baba was captured as a party to the conflict, and he was by any definition, on the losing side. And he was an opponent against the Sultan who arrested him. And even so, even in a state of active conflict, the Moroccan Sultan, the Moroccan court, could not bear to treat him as anything other than what he was, which is one of the greatest legal minds of his age. You understand me? He kept teaching, he kept issuing fatwa, he kept publishing. Students were allowed to travel and meet him in Marrakesh from all across the Muslim world. There was no restriction placed on who could come and sit at his feet to learn from him, political prisoner or not. 12 years he spent there, 12 years. And when he finally went back to Timbuktu, his fame and his renown had grown, and his students had increased, and his published works had multiplied throughout the time during which you could say he was under house arrest in Marrakesh. See, that's a measure of a civilization's real character, not whether conflict happens, because conflict is going to happen. Conflict always happens in any century between any power, But look, they did not humiliate him. They didn't kill him. They didn't cut him off. They didn't really even imprison him. He was under house arrest. He still taught, he still published, he was still visited by students and by scholars. Do you understand? Morocco didn't say, oh, the Songhai, they're black, they're African, they're nothing, they don't have anything, they're primitive, they're backwards, we have to civilize them. No, nobody acted like this. No, that never happened. They treated that scholar with respect and with dignity, and they valued his knowledge to the point that, like I say, when he returned to Timbuktu, his renown and his stature had only increased, even though he was opposed to the Moroccans. Were you like that? Were the colonizers like that? Were you like that with the African scholars and the academics and the intellectuals who opposed you? Did you honor them? Did you respect them? Did you let them continue to host students and teach? No, I'll tell you what you did. In Algeria, for example, one of the leading legal minds in Algeria, one of the leading legal minds of the Algerian independence movement, Ali Boumendjel, in February 1957, French paratroopers abducted him, held him in solitary confinement, and tortured him for 43 days. And then they killed him, and they threw his body from a 6th-floor window out of a building. And then you lied about it for 60 years, telling the world that he had committed suicide. That's what you did. That's how you dealt with them. And in that same year, that same campaign, you arrested Maurice Audin, a French Algerian mathematician. He was working at the University of Algiers. And you arrested him, and you tortured him, and you killed him, and you also with him, you covered up his death for decades until Macron admitted that the French military was responsible for his death and his murder and his torture too. Back in 2018, they said it finally. And everybody knows what you did to Omar Mukhtar in Libya. Did you let him continue teaching Quran? He was a Quran teacher. Did you let him keep teaching his students? Let his students come and sit at his feet and learn? No, you hanged him in front of his people. That's what you did. So set that against Ahmed Baba, right? He was captured. He was given students. He was given a platform. He was allowed to become more and more famous, more renowned under house arrest than he had been before it. Now, was it right to arrest him? No. In my opinion, no. Was it right for Morocco to attack the Songhai Empire? No. But again, that's just power geopolitics between two powerful African kingdoms. Nothing about that is colonization. That's just power consolidation between one African power player against another, trying to secure end-to-end control of a trade route. That's all that was. Nobody pretended that it was about race, that it was about superior or inferior or anything like that. No one tried to erase the culture. No one tried to deny the merits of the people of the Songhai or their accomplishments. I mean, what did you do? What did the West do when you came to Timbuktu, when French forces occupied Timbuktu in December 1893? slaughter, collective punishment, looting, hostage taking. And this was explicitly undertaken by the French as part of a broader military campaign of explicitly imperial expansion, what they called French Sudan. The French Sudan, they called it. You came to Timbuktu and you stayed there from 1894 until 1959. That was the city that produced the most elite scholarship in West Africa, Islamic scholarship. They had built one of the great manuscript traditions in African history, hundreds of thousands of pages. Hundreds of thousands of pages of law, of theology, of astronomy, of science, of medicine, built by generations of African Muslims and their students in their own institutions, brilliant minds. And under French colonial administration, most of those manuscripts were seized and were burned. They weren't studied, they weren't preserved, they weren't respected, they were destroyed. And the damage didn't even stop when the colonizers left. To this day, families in Timbuktu will keep manuscripts that they've hidden for decades. They'll keep it hidden away from outside researchers because of the memory of that era and what it taught them, that if you let a foreign power know what you've got, that's how you're going to lose it. You understand that fear outlived French rule by over 60 years. That's how deep the cut is. You see how they do? And today in English, the word Timbuktu is a joke to you. You took the name of one of the most accomplished cities, one of the most respected cities, one of the most honored and one of the most brilliant cities in Muslim Africa, and you turned Timbuktu into a synonym for the middle of nowhere. It's a joke to you, the name. You see how they do? So look at the whole thing. You had a Moroccan sultan who invades Songhai, what's now Mali, against the explicit religious advice of the scholars, telling him that it's haram to do it, but he does it anyway. He captures a scholar who's an opposition scholar, and he lets that scholar gather students from across the Muslim world for 12 years until he returns home back to Timbuktu, more celebrated than when he left. And then 3 centuries later, French forces enter that same city, Timbuktu, and what follows is manuscripts getting burned, a scholarly tradition being treated as something to loot and destroy, and you instill a fear so deep in people that it still shapes Timbuktu's families and how they guard their own history until today. You murder intellectuals, you murder scholars, you murder academics, you murder brilliant minds because they are opposed to you. Because their opposition to you matters more to you than their brilliance. You torture them and you murder them. And then you lie about torturing and murdering them. Meanwhile, we've got 300 years earlier than that, a Moroccan sultan who himself is so arrogant and so irreligious, such a bad person, that he even overrules the Islamic scholars and he captures a scholar who's opposed to his rule. But even him, he lets him keep teaching and he keeps getting students and getting respect. Because even for him, even for someone like that, even for someone who committed crimes like that, the scholar's brilliance was more important to him than the fact that that scholar opposed him. And the fact that that scholar was a so-called black African didn't matter to anyone. No, he was a brilliant Muslim brother. He was a brilliant and respected and dignified Muslim brother. Now, nobody cared about race. Nobody cared about so-called race or color. No one cared about Arab or African. And even if you have instances in history where there was Arabs and Africans fighting each other, it wasn't because they were Arabs and Africans. It was for the same normal reasons that conflicts always occur. It would have never occurred to anyone that so-called race mattered. They didn't know anything about that. Do you understand me? There was literally never a time when Muslims were ethnically homogenous. Every single Muslim community, from even before the Hijrah, was diverse in terms of what you would call race, so-called race or ethnicity or land of origin. I mean, Ethiopians were in control of Yemen for a long time. There has never been a time when there was not interaction with Africa. There was intermingling, there was intermarriage, and so forth, from the beginning and continuously until today. Again, do not project Western attitudes onto everybody. Don't project it on people now and don't project it upon people in the past. People who lived and interacted centuries before the Europeans ever even came up with their grotesque concepts about so-called race and white supremacy. Nobody thought like that. That wouldn't have even occurred to anyone. Like I say, alhamdulillah, Islam is the only religion that explicitly condemns what you know today as racism or ethnocentrism or ethno-chauvinism. So-called black over so-called white or so-called white over so-called black or Arab over non-Arab or vice versa. That was literally and explicitly forbidden by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself. And that is the understanding that our people have always operated upon. I mean, the Hajj itself, alhamdulillah, the Hajj itself reinforces that. It's a mechanism of equalization among the entire ummah. You've got Hujjaj from Africa walking alongside Arabs and Turks and Persians and South Asians, Southeast Asians on the same ground, all performing the same rites. counted as all counted as full equal members of the same global community, the same global ummah. Now, distance was the only real barrier that African Muslims ever faced. Distance is just a fact of geography, nothing you can do about that, same as Muslims in Southeast Asia or China or what have you. You understand me? But Africans were never looked upon and never dealt with any differently than people from any other locations that are outside of the sort of immediate geographic area of familiarity. But again, there is no Muslim community outside the Arab world or even any non-Arab community anywhere outside the Arab world with whom the Arab world and the Muslim world was more closely intertwined than Africans, than Africa. And that was the case long before even Islam came. Now, I've told you, and it's completely factual, that Islam spread through most of Africa across many centuries without compulsion, without coercion, without fighting, without conflict, mostly through trade and mostly through interaction. African people, by their own intelligence, by their own conviction, alhamdulillah, embraced Islam. So if you mean the spread of the faith when you talk about colonization or imperialism, if you say that conversion of Islam represented some sort of an imperial project on the part of the Muslims, you're a liar. You're a liar. Conversion was never imposed, and it was never even institutionally supported under Muslim governments. Embracing Islam was an act of conscience and an act of intelligence and an act of free agency by African people, whether any particular land was ruled by the Muslims or not ruled by the Muslims. So let's put that aside. Let's put that aside. Now, if by colonization or if by imperialism, what you mean is the actual military campaigns that did take place by Muslims on the continent of Africa, and that resulted in Muslim political authority being established over a land, okay, we can talk about that. No one is here to deny that that happened. And I'll gladly get into it. Because it also bears no resemblance whatsoever to Western colonization, Western imperialism. That is also a wrong comparison. But I just want to make sure that you're perfectly clear on the fact that even when military campaigns did occur, and even when Muslim political authority was established over any particular land, that did not include any sort of coerced or compelled conversion to Islam of the domestic population. That fact by itself, and it is a fact, that fact by itself should let you know that this is something very different from what the Europeans did in Africa. But like I said, be patient. Inshallah bi'idhnillah, I'm going to talk about everything. Inshallah bi'idhnillah, I'm going to talk about everything. And I hope that by the end of this, you will have a clear understanding about the objective reality of the history of Islam in Africa and be able to arm yourself against this divisive Western campaign of disinformation and misinformation and lies. Because look, like I said at the beginning, when you lie to each other about us, you know, when you lie to each other about us, Westerner to Westerner, colonizer to colonizer, it's unimportant. Truly, it could not matter any less. We are long past the colonized mindset of having side character syndrome, supporting cast syndrome, background player extra syndrome, where we just accept that you all are the main character always and everywhere. We're past that. And the things that you tell each other about us are so moronic and so laughable that it just shows us anyway that your minds aren't even worth winning to our side anyway. You understand? Having you as friends would increase us in nothing but headaches. Wallahi. And our own intelligence would drop. But when you lie about us to our friends, like I said last time, you lie about us to our brothers and sisters in Africa, to our kin, we're going to respond to that. Because it matters to us that our friends and our brothers and sisters are not lied to, and it matters to us that we are not misrepresented to them. And we're not going to let you insert yourself as some sort of an intermediary between us. There has never been an intermediary between us, not for thousands of years. No, you have nothing to do with our history, and you have nothing to do with our relationship. And you have shown us, and you have shown them, again and again, through our history and right up until right now, that you hate them and you hate us. You hate Africans, and you hate Arabs, and you hate Muslims. So wallahi, anyone who is African, anyone who is Arab, anyone who is Muslim has no reason whatsoever to listen to a single word that you say. Okay, so like I said, this is a very long history that you're talking about. It's a very long history. It's a very long and deeply interwoven history, and a very long and deeply interwoven relationship between Muslims and Africa, between the Arab world and Africa, between Africa and just the Arabian Peninsula. I mean, the waterways that divide the Jazirat al-Arab from the continent of Africa. These aren't oceans. We're not talking about oceans. It's not like the distance between Namibia and Germany, or between the UK and Nigeria, or between Belgium and the Congo. They're very close. And you had, over the course of centuries, multiple civilizations and kingdoms and empires and whatnot that had existed over the course of centuries or millennia before Islam came, that had already integrated and incorporated African lands with Arab lands, with Mediterranean lands, and so on under one, jurisdiction, for lack of a better word. It's important to understand this too when we start talking about the trans-Saharan slave trade, because this is another topic that gets misrepresented and mischaracterized, predictably for completely self-serving reasons. But when we talk about it, we will talk about it accurately and in context, without any hedging, without any spinning, inshallah. But first, I want to talk more about this idea of colonization of Africa by the Muslims, and the spread of Islam in Africa, and that you characterize as colonization. Because before, like I said last time, you have to define what you mean by the spread of Islam. What do you mean by that? And, in the context of Muslim colonization, I've already explained the factual history that the spread of the faith, adherence to the faith, conversion to Islam in Africa was without force. This was never done by force by the Muslims. I explained that you even had countries or lands that were under Muslim authority, Muslim rule, where the population remained majority non-Muslim for centuries. In other words, there was no real difference in the rates of conversion across Africa, whether you had a Muslim political authority over them or not, whether the land was under the Muslims or it was not under the Muslims. People converted at the same pace, right? The Islam itself, embrace of Islam, spread organically across Africa over the course of centuries. So no, this cannot be understood, and it cannot be portrayed honestly as anything like colonization or anything like imperialism. This was societies and people willingly on their own, adopting the deen out of their own intelligence and their own conviction, and making it their own. Again, this is overwhelmingly how Islam spread, the religion itself. Historically and now, how it's spreading now is the same. How it's spreading now faster than any belief system. Is that by force? People just get exposed to it. They interact with Muslims. They learn about it. They study about it. They research about it and so forth. And then they become independently convinced. That's all. Same now as it was then, and same then as it is now. So that can't be it. So if you mean by colonization some mass migration of Arabs into Africa, changing the demographics, well, that didn't happen either. That didn't happen either. In fact, a lot of the time, what gets called Arab, when you have these discussions about the history of Muslims in Africa, a lot of what gets called Arab is actually indigenous Africans who were Muslims. You understand me? You assign an Arabic identity and an Arabic origin to them based upon their religion. No, the overwhelming majority of Muslims in Africa are now and always have been indigenous Africans. I mean, the truth of the matter is that most of the time when you talk about Arab, when you say Arab in these discussions, what you mean is Berbers. You mean the Amazigh people, who are the Amazigh people are about as indigenous African as you can possibly get. They've been in Africa since before the Sahara Desert was a desert. You understand me? So no, there was no mass migration of Arabs into Africa that altered the demographics of Africa or altered even the lands in Africa that were under the Muslims. So we have to put those two definitions aside. You can't mean that. The spread of Islam was not colonization, and there was no colonization by means of migration and population replacement. Those two things didn't happen. I mean, in terms of the spread of Islam happened, the spread of adherence to the faith happened, but over the course of centuries and not by force. And there was no mass migration. So what you must mean when you say, or when you talk about colonization by the Muslims, you must mean the actual military campaigns that took place by the Muslims on the continent of Africa, and that specifically which led to the establishment of Muslim political authority over those lands. That is something that happened, and we can talk about that, and we will talk about it. So yes, it's true, Islam spread, the religion spread without compulsion, and it's also true that the Muslims had or led a military campaign across North Africa, beginning in Egypt around in the 640s. And then it ended in 710 or so in Morocco. So yes, you had about 60 to 70 years out of the last 1,400 years in which the Muslims undertook a military campaign across North Africa and established political authority in, say, Egypt, Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and so forth. Now, I have to remind you, this does not mean spreading Islam. This does not mean spreading Islam. Those campaigns were not campaigns of conversion. They were explicitly campaigns against the Byzantine imperial domination of North Africa. Understand this. The target was explicit and specific. against the so-called Exarchate of Africa of the Byzantine Empire, centered in Carthage in Libya. These are the lands that we're talking about, only these lands. Those people had been conquered by the Byzantines, and they were living under the colonial administration of Constantinople through what they called exarchs, governors, who were appointed by the emperor in Constantinople. And those governors had totalitarian dictatorial power, and most of them were Greeks. None of them were Africans. You understand me? Now, I told you, we don't do surface analysis, 360 degrees, okay? So you have to know something about the Byzantines in Africa, because this was really like an early prototype of the Western colonizer model. They came in and they took over, right? They came in, took over violently. They brutally maintained their control through violence. They forced conversions on people. They persecuted religious minorities in their communities, in those lands. They siphoned off wealth from those lands to the imperial center. It was a fundamentally extractive economic model, imposed by foreigners and administered and ruled and governed by foreigners. Does it sound familiar? Any reports that we have, which are very few, of Africans by Africans living under the Byzantines at that time, they said it was internal strife, nothing but internal strife, social upheaval, and plague. And it's true, it was very unstable. The Berbers fought against them, and then they had even their own soldiers would mutiny against them, their own officials. They were bleeding the economy dry by forcing exorbitant tributes to be sent to Constantinople and so forth. It was not a good situation at all. And there's even a before that as well. I don't want to go too far back, but before the Byzantines, there was the Vandals. The Vandals took over North Africa, and they took it over from the Roman Empire. Before the Vandals came, it was under the Roman Empire for around 500 years. See, the Vandals came and they took over, and then the Byzantines came and kicked out the Vandals in what they considered a reconquest, because for the Byzantines, they didn't call themselves Byzantines. You understand? They were the other half of the Roman Empire. So they considered themselves, they called themselves taking it back for Rome. You understand me? Okay, so the point is, these lands in North Africa that we're talking about had been functionally under one form or another of foreign colonization and imperial control for roughly 850 years. Understand this, with administrative power almost exclusively being non-African, non-indigenous people, Romans, Italians, Germans, or the Vandals were German, or anyway, Germanic people. And yes, that's where the word Vandal comes from, by the way, and for a reason, and Greeks, right? So, in other words, when you're talking about North Africa in the year 640, when the Muslim military campaigns began, you're not talking about Africa. You're talking about the provinces of an empire that imposed foreign rule, that persecuted minorities, that extracted wealth ruthlessly, and that completely excluded indigenous Africans from power in their own lands. I mean, if you want to pretend that when the Muslims and the Arabs came and they invaded, do you think that they invaded and they took over free, independent African countries? You're living in a world of your own Western imagination. You have to remember this about history. You have to remember that history is a continuum, that there's a context for everything. So yes, the Muslims did engage in a military campaign in North Africa. Yes, they did. And the rationale for that campaign was both moral and strategic, and it holds up. It holds up to scrutiny, and it holds up to examination. Like I said, Byzantine rule in North Africa is documented. It's not just me saying it. It's documented by mainstream historical sources. It was notorious for corruption. They were notorious for extortion. They were notorious for persecution, and notorious for their violence. You understand? Persecution. There was a sect there called the Donatists. There was a major North African Christian community that was regarded by Constantinople as heretics. They called them heretics. So Constantinople was forcing their own version of orthodoxy upon a population, a North African indigenous population that resisted it. It may be worth noting, by the way, that the Donatist sect, the thing that set them apart from the rest of the Christians, was that they thought that church leaders ought to be above moral reproach. They thought that the priests and whatnot shouldn't be sinners, open sinners. They thought that they should practice what they preach, and that got them persecuted. They got persecuted for that. That's just by the way. That was the reason. They didn't have some weird doctrinal thing. They just thought that you ought to practice what you preach. And they were persecuted for that. That's just for your own information. Now, this was a foreign occupation. This was foreign imperial rule by the Byzantines. And it was extractive, and it was religiously intolerant, and it was violent. And it was imposed by force upon North Africa from Constantinople. That's a fact. This is who the Muslims were confronting. This is who. And this is who they understood themselves to be confronting. You understand me? Not Africans, Byzantines. Alhamdulillah that we won. Do you understand? See, when the Westerners, when they want to say that the Muslims were colonizers, they want to say that the Muslims were imperialists and what have you. You see what they're trying to do? They're trying to transfer their actual history onto us. And when they say that they were liberators in their history, they want to say that they were liberators, they brought freedom, they brought human rights, they brought civilization. They're trying to transfer our history to them. That's a fact. They want to pretend that Muslim history is their history, I'm telling you. No, when the Muslims fought against the Byzantines, not the Africans, when we fought against the Byzantines, when we kicked them out of North Africa, we ended over 800 years of foreign occupation and domination in North Africa. 800 years of domination, oppression, and persecution. Again, this is just a historical fact. Now let me repeat, because I know that you can't help yourself, you Westerners who are listening, with your dysfunctional reflexes. I am not trying to tell you that Muslim rule in these lands was perfect. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that there weren't mistakes. Mistakes didn't happen. There wasn't wrongdoing here and there. I'm not saying any of that. But what I am saying unequivocally is that what Muslims established in those lands was indisputably better than what had been there before. Yes, absolutely. Life under Muslim rule was objectively better than it had been under the Byzantine Empire, under the Christians, under the Byzantines. Like I said, under the Byzantines, it was extremely extractive. Extremely extractive. As far as they were concerned, North Africa existed to send wealth back to the imperial center. That was the whole point of Africa's existence. They saw it the same way that the British saw Africa, the same way that the Portuguese saw it, the same way that the French saw it, the same way that the Belgians saw it, the same way that the Americans see it right now. They used to tax people beyond belief. The tax burden was unbearable. They made people pay tribute to Constantinople beyond what they could possibly pay. They were bleeding that land dry economically. When the Muslims came, they imposed much lighter taxes. They had taxes, but it was much lighter than the Byzantines. And the whole tribute system, at least as it existed under the Byzantines, that was functionally dismantled or very rearranged. You had communities that would actually negotiate with the Muslims about how much they would pay. It was a negotiation. It wasn't dictation. And that money was for security, for defense, for infrastructure, for administration, and so forth. And that money didn't get collected, by the way, by some imperial Arab collector going house to house and then sending the money back to the capital. The communities themselves would collect it. But they would decide who could pay, who couldn't pay by community leaders. They would arrange all of that, and then they would pass the money on to the provincial governor. You understand? It was negotiated. Like I say, it was negotiated, communal, localized. And the tribute or the tax was fixed contractually. You couldn't just come in all of a sudden and say, it's going to be twice as much now. You have to pay us twice as much now because we say so. No, it was fixed. And if you were a non-Muslim, okay, first you don't have to serve in the army. You have to pay jizya. You don't serve in the army. You pay jizya. Muslims pay zakah. You pay jizya. And the expenses of that go for the upkeep of the society itself. It was not extractive by nature. You understand me? And like I say, it wasn't being overseen or it wasn't being undertaken by Arab Muslim officials like Romans, tax collectors, the Byzantines, the Christians. You understand? The Muslims negotiated agreements with the towns themselves, with local indigenous leaders. There was no big, at that time, rigid imperial bureaucracy. The leaders themselves were responsible for collecting the taxes themselves among their community, and that gave them a lot of autonomy. A lot more than they enjoyed under the Byzantine colonizers. Like, we've agreed to pay such and such to the Muslim authorities. We've agreed to pay such and such. Well, the Muslims don't care who's paying, who's not paying. We just have a certain amount that you're supposed to give us. And the local community leaders, they can organize that themselves. So they had a lot of autonomy, at least more autonomy than they had under the Byzantines. There was no tax collectors coming house to house. You understand? And like I say, there was religious tolerance. Under the Muslims, there was religious tolerance that they had not experienced for centuries. SubhanAllah, the Byzantine Empire had spent centuries enforcing their own religious doctrine, their own religious conformity and orthodoxy. You know, if you didn't follow the official interpretation, you're a heretic, you get persecuted. I mean, not to mention Jewish communities in North Africa, they were obviously persecuted. Well, the Muslims stopped all that, alhamdulillah. Christians and Jews were allowed to practice under Islam, under Muslim rule, practice their religion. Yes, they paid taxes as non-Muslim subjects, but they were left to govern their own religious affairs. We didn't care about that. Like I say, we are practical people. Muslims are practical people. Muslims didn't go there to force anyone religiously either way, one way or another. Not in terms of our own faith and not for any particular interpretation of your own faith. That's your own business. We're just concerned about political stability and public order. You understand? So yes, a lot of Christians, and certainly Jews, but definitely also a lot of Christians had it much better, and they had more freedom under the Muslims than they had ever had under their own Christians, under their own Christian brothers. And look, when the Muslims came to North Africa, when the Muslims and the Arabs helped to liberate North Africa from the Byzantines, because that's what that was, those lands stopped being just the western edge of a foreign empire. North Africa itself became part of an enormous commercial network. You understand me? From the Atlantic coast to Central Asia, to the Indian Ocean. For those lands, trade expanded, urban centers grew. See, you have to understand something. Again, this is one of the dramatic differences between European Western colonization and what actually in real life happened with the Muslims in Africa. You have to understand this. Now, remember I said, first let me remind you, those lands had been under foreign domination and rule for over 800 years. They were ruled by Greeks, Germanic people, and Italians. Okay? But look what happened with us. That wasn't like that with us. Okay, first let me look at the military campaigns, okay? Let me be organized about this. Egypt was the first. The Muslim army was predominantly Arab that took control of Egypt. If you want to take religion out of it, yes, okay. That was an Arab military campaign in Africa, in Egypt. Yes, that was almost all Arabs when they kicked the Byzantines out of Egypt. 90 to 95%. Libya was the same, or Eastern Libya. The army was almost all Arabs. That was between 642, 647. But then when you get into Carthage, you get into Tunisia, you get into Algeria, Western Maghreb, and so forth, you start to see that the fighters were about 50-50. 50% Arab, 50% indigenous Africans, Berbers and Amazigh people and so forth. And by the time Morocco was liberated, it was majority indigenous Africans in the army. That was an African army that liberated Morocco. You understand me? Most of it. Mostly. So that's first of all. The only lands that were actually liberated by Arab Muslims or predominantly Arab Muslims that were fighting in the campaign, that's going to be Egypt and Eastern Libya. All of the other lands that were liberated by armies that were both Arab and African, mixed. African Muslims participating in kicking out their own Byzantine colonizers alongside their Arab brothers. That's the real history. That's the real history. That's not spin. That's not narrative. We're unspinning the false narratives here. Do you understand me? So like I said, even Libya was now Libya. Only the eastern part of Libya was actually liberated by a Muslim army that was 90% Arab. So really it's only Egypt. Only Egypt. Because the rest of Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, this was all done by militaries that were increasingly over time dominated by locals, indigenous Africans. And Islam gave them the strength and Islam gave them the support to rise up against the Byzantine occupation that they had been living under for over 800 years. That's the real story. That's the real story. And the Berbers, the Amazigh, I mean, they fought everyone. They fought everyone. They fought the Romans. They fought the Vandals. They fought the Byzantines. This was a tough people then and now. And they fought the Muslims too. The Berbers fought the Muslims too. Yes, they did. That's why it took so long. That's why it took so long, you see. I mean, you see, like Egypt and East Libya, right? The Arab Muslims kicked the Byzantines out of Egypt and Eastern Libya in about 5 years. Just took about 5 years. But Tunisia, that was decades. That took decades. The rest of Libya, that took decades. Because of the Berbers, because of the Amazigh. They fought tooth and nail. I said they fought the Romans. They fought the Romans and they failed, but they kept fighting. They fought the Vandals, but they failed, but kept fighting. And they fought the Byzantines, and they were failing, but they were still fighting. And they fought the Muslims when the Muslims came. And then they embraced Islam. And once they embraced Islam, that's when they won against the Byzantines as Muslims. And Islam is what gave them the power to do it. Yes, like I said, the Berbers were fighting. The Berbers fought against the Muslims too. They fought against the Arabs. And they fought hard. They fought hard. That's why it took so long, like I said. Because anyway, that's what they've been doing for centuries. They've been fighting against other foreign forces for centuries. And that's what they would have seen the Arabs as. Just another foreign power coming to take over. That's how they would have seen them. That's all they'd ever been doing for centuries anyway, was fighting against foreign powers. And then the Arabs themselves, the Muslims themselves, they fought against them because if you can't stabilize your control, then those Byzantines are going to come right back. You already know that they will. So this wasn't about Arab domination or Berber suppression. It was about preventing another reconquest by the Byzantines. Because we know how much they like reconquest. You understand? That's not just me saying it, because look what actually happened. Look what actually happened. This is what I was getting to when I started talking about this. Once political control had been stabilized, almost all of the people in charge were locals, not Arabs, not foreigners, indigenous African Muslims, Berbers who embraced Islam. They became soldiers, they became scholars, they became governors, and they eventually became the rulers. Within just a few short generations, Berber Muslims were leading the whole region. You understand? It was the Berber armies, Amazigh armies, that established Andalusia in Spain. I mean, Berber dynasties like the Almoravids, like the Almohads, they built powerful empires that ruled in North Africa and in Al-Andalus in Spain. You understand me? Africans. I bet you didn't know that Africans ruled in Spain from the 11th to the 13th centuries. No, you didn't know that. One of the reasons you don't know that is because what you've been taught, or how you've been taught to think, is that if they're African and they're Muslim at the same time, well, that means that they're Arab. But like I said, you can't get much more indigenous African than the Berbers, than the Amazigh people. They're about as indigenous as you can get. But truth be told, another reason that you don't know that is from outside. It's from outside, not just the West misinterpretation. One of the reasons that you don't know that you had Africans ruling in Spain, one of the reasons is because we don't think of ourselves that way. You understand? For us, we're just Muslims. That's how we understand it, literally. We don't define by so-called ethnicity or race or color. We just say Muslim Spain. You understand? We say Muslim Spain, Muslim armies, Muslim governments, Muslim scholars, Muslim dynasties, Muslim accomplishments. We don't attach ethnicity to any of those things. We're not obsessed with what you are obsessed with. We base our identity on Islam. You understand me? And because of that, you get to say whatever you want to say. And you get to imply whatever you want to imply. That everything was Arab. That Arabs took over North Africa. Arabs did this. Arabs did that. The Arabs ruled Spain. Because that's how you think. That's not how we think. That's not how we think. I mean, if you want to put it, if you want me to put it in your terms, okay? Africans rose up and liberated themselves from Byzantine occupation and colonial rule with the help of Arabs. And in the wake of that expulsion of colonizer Christian Byzantines, you had indigenous power structures that were developed and that were controlled by indigenous Africans. There, that's how it was. Does it make it easier to understand when I put it in your terms, in the terms of ethnicity and nationality? Because it's the same story, but we just take the ethnicity and the so-called race and the color and the nationality, we just take it out of it and we say Muslim. But that's what happened. If you want to put it in those terms, ethnic terms, racial so-called terms, color terms, nationalistic terms, yes. Africans rose up and kicked out an 850-year-old colonizing occupation in their lands with the help of Arabs. And then once they kicked them out, they built their own governments. They established their own rule. They established their own indigenous, independent empires and dynasties and governments and ruling system. African. Because that's what actually happened. So you get messed up about it when the word Muslim gets involved. You get confused when the word Muslim or the word Islam gets involved. Then all of a sudden you don't know. Because I understand it, like I said, because we don't think of ourselves that way. So as soon as we take the race out of it, so-called race, we take the so-called race out of it, we take the so-called nationality out of it, we take so-called ethnicity out of it, and we only think about it as Islam and Muslims, well, your brain doesn't know how to process it. And you think Islam means Arab, so therefore every time you see the word Islam, you see the word Muslim, you see Muslim Spain, it must be Arab Spain. You see Muslim Africa, must be Arab Africa. That's how you think. So the absence of us using those words lets you just put those words in there on your own. It's like an autofill. But see, there's another reason. In fact, there's another reason why you would never know or you would never understand that Spain was under African control for 200 years. One of the reasons is because you have a very specific image in your mind of what African means, right? Of what African looks like. If you're African, you have to look a certain kind of way. And that certain kind of way is basically means the Africans that you brought over there on slave ships. West African, Central African, and so on. That's what you think. So you have this visual bias. When you see a Tunisian, for example, or an Algerian, for example, you can't get your brain to accept that person as African because he doesn't look the way you think that Africans are supposed to look like. He doesn't look like one of the ones that we brought over on the slave ship, right? Even though his whole lineage, his whole family line is indigenous African. And then it also doesn't help. He's Muslim, so I don't understand that. He speaks Arabic, so I don't understand that. So he must be Arab. He doesn't look like an African that I think of. He doesn't sound like an African that I think of. And his religion isn't what I think an African's religion is supposed to be. So he has to be Arab. Yeah, in fact, that's another thing, actually. That's another thing. I don't want to get too sidetracked with this particular train of thought, but that is another thing. And this goes back to why we have to use our own frameworks and not use your frameworks. Because for Arabs, they have an understanding that it means you just speak Arabic. Right? If you speak Arabic, you are Arab. Which is why Pan-Arabism, when that happened, it was inclusive of North Africa. See, you only think in terms of race and ethnicity. So you don't even understand what Arabs mean when they say that someone is Arab. You don't know whether they mean genealogically or linguistically. So you get confused. And then you come up with this whole Arabized, this stupid term Arabized. Like Africans aren't Africans if they're Muslim. Like Africans aren't Africans if they speak Arabic. They've been Arabized. They've been Arabized, like some kind of magic spell. You've been hypnotized. You've been mesmerized. You've been Arabized, right? Wallahi, you don't understand anything. So no, the military campaigns, the Muslim military campaigns against the Byzantines in North Africa, that was not, we're not talking about Arab control, Arab domination, Arab colonial officials, Arab imperial soldiers, imperial tax collectors, Arab judges, Arab governors. No, no. For the first time in almost a millennium, those countries actually had indigenous authorities, indigenous authority structures. And you want to call that colonization? How? The overwhelming majority of the people remained the same indigenous populations, genetically, genealogically, that had lived there before Islam came. And once Islam came, or after Islam came, they overwhelmingly ran their own local regional governments. And they became their own major autonomous independent powers. And yes, non-Muslim Africans also were not excluded from the power structures either. No population that was ever conquered by European colonial powers ever had anything like that under Western colonizers, ever, anywhere on the continent of Africa or anywhere else in the world, at any point in the colonial history. Full integration into the whole civilizational structure as equal players, as autonomous indigenous rulers. That's not what colonization looks like, subhanAllah. That's the opposite of what colonization looks like. What are you talking about? And look, again, see how things actually turned out. See how things actually turned out. Because I told you at the beginning, I told you that the Arabs, that the Muslims, they only carried out the campaign, the military campaign, to dislodge the colonizer Byzantines, right? Not just for the sake of wanton expansion, imperial expansion. Now you could say, oh sure, brother Shahid, that's what they said. Right? That's what they said. That's how they rationalized it to themselves. That's how they justified it to themselves, right? You could say that. But they were really waging a military campaign to take over Africa. That's what they were really doing. They just want to expand their empire, right? That would be the claim, that it was just talk. Well, here's the proof that the stated rationale was actually genuine rather than just a pretext for empire building, was that as soon as the Christian Byzantine Empire was kicked out, they stopped. You understand? Once the Byzantine imperial presence in North Africa was gone, the Muslim armies didn't keep pushing. They didn't keep pushing south, looking for new territory to seize. They could have done it, but they didn't. That could have happened, but it didn't happen. I mean, they definitely could have done it. By then, the Berbers, the Amazigh people, they were making up most of the army, and they know better than anyone else how to cross the Sahara, so they could have done it. They already had the trade routes. They were already familiar with it. They already knew how to do it. I mean, we know that they could do it because eventually the Moroccans did, right? The Moroccans did, I talked about it last time, come across the Sahara and attack the Songhai in Mali. They did it. So they had the ability to do it. They could do it. They had the capability to do it. They had the capacity to do it, but they didn't do it. I mean, Islam's subsequent spread across the rest of the continent, down through the Sahara, along the Swahili coast of East Africa, into the Sahel. This, as I've talked about before, and is historical record, this happened through trade. This happened through trade and interaction and no military campaign. Do you understand? So if your suspicion that the underlying motive was imperial expansion for its own sake, and that that's really why they did what they did, well, you had the whole rest of the continent to conquer. Why didn't you keep going? I mean, think about it. You had already an ongoing trans-Saharan trade that had been going on for centuries. Everybody knew that. So everybody knew that if you had kept going, if the army had kept going, there was immense wealth and resources that you could gain, but they didn't. They didn't. You understand? A force that's actually interested in empire building isn't going to stop at the borders of the specific imperial power that they set out to remove and then just stop. They would continue. They would keep expanding. I mean, you're on a winning streak, right? You're on a winning streak. You're unstoppable. But they just turned off the engine of their own juggernaut, their own military juggernaut. They turned off the engine because they were not interested in conquering anybody. Do you understand me? This is how you know it was not a rationale. It wasn't a pretext. It was a reason. They meant it. That's how you know. So that's the real story. That's the real story of Arab and Muslim so-called colonization in Africa. The real story is that they kicked colonizers out of Africa and gave power back to Africans after almost a millennium, and then they put their swords down. And you call that colonization. I've told you before, whatever they say, you've got to run it backwards. They speak in code. They talk backwards. Run it in reverse, and then you might get some kind of a clue about what the real truth is. And let me say something here. I don't even know, actually, if this is even part of the Western disinformation campaign to try to divide Muslims from Africans. I don't know if it's even something that they talk about. I don't know if it's something that they say, because frankly, I don't know if they even know about history enough. I don't think that they do know enough about history to even talk about it in the first place. But let me address it anyway. You know, it is actually possible. It's actually possible to recognize differences between people. Differences between, skin colors, features, places of origin, language, and so forth. It's possible to notice those differences without hating anyone, without it becoming some sort of a hierarchical ranking system. You have this weird thing in the West that, like, in order to not be a racist or not be a white supremacist or to prove that you're supposed to claim to be colorblind, right? You're supposed to claim to not see color. Because what? If you even see color, if you even notice color, if you even acknowledge difference, then that automatically means it has to automatically come with discrimination and prejudice and bigotry. Like that's the only way that it can go. Like the only way to not be a bigot is to be blind. I mean, think about what they're saying. Think about what that actually is saying when they say that. If you so much as recognize difference, then the automatic next move in that sequence is to rank superior and inferior and put people in a racial hierarchy. If you so much as notice color, like the only way to not do that is to be so-called colorblind. Now that's twisted. Look, in Islam, alhamdulillah, we're prohibited from ranking humanity by any sort of immutable characteristics or features like complexion or physical appearance or place of origin or language. I mean, language isn't an immutable characteristic, but you know what I mean. While simultaneously, Islam tells us Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created diversity among mankind precisely so that we can know each other. See, you're supposed to see it. You're supposed to recognize it. You're supposed to acknowledge it. You're supposed to take note of it. It's informative. It's informative. If someone looks a certain kind of way, then you know roughly where on this planet they originated, likely, or their people originated. Just like how everyone knows how absurd it is to try to make anyone with any sense, for example, look at a what's her name? Charlize Theron, and go, yeah, she's African. No, come on. No, I know by looking at you where you come from, roughly. Like if you see even if you see a pale-skinned person walking around in America, well, I know by looking at you that you don't come from there. You see, it's informative. Or if you see a dark-skinned person, right, with the features of typical of sub-Saharan Africans, you see them walking around in Ohio, okay, that's not where you come from. That's not where you come from. Means there's a story behind why you are there, why an African is there, why a European is there, or why a European is in sub-Saharan Africa. You understand? You see what I mean? It is informative. It's part of how we can know about each other. Islam teaches us that you don't have to abandon that. You don't have to abandon that. Islam teaches us to see it for what it is, and it forbids us from making it anything more than it is. You understand me? There's no hierarchy except piety and good character and knowledge in Islam. Right? This is the only hierarchy that we acknowledge. And we are forbidden from the ignorance of thinking, this one is better than that one, or that one is better than this one, based on physical characteristics, like color or what have you. Looking different in the Muslim world, looking different was never a death sentence. Not in the Muslim world, and it was never a sentence for enslavement or subjugation, unlike in the West. See, we all know that when the West categorizes you as different, that there's an implicit threat in that categorization. Different means worse, and worse means eligible for subjugation, eligible for annihilation. That's your record. That's the Western record. So the only way that a so-called Westerner can try to convince themselves or convince anyone else that they don't think like this, they have to say, I don't even see color. which is in fact an inadvertent confession that they think that seeing color automatically means ranking by color. See, that's not the case in the Muslim world, alhamdulillah, or in many other civilizations, not only Muslims. It's really a peculiarity of the West. I think in most places around the world, people don't think like that. I think in most places. So again, see, this goes back to trying to not make the mistake of retroactively projecting Western concepts on other people outside the West, other cultures, other civilizations, or to project it upon people who lived centuries before those Western concepts were even cooked up. You see? So yes, the Muslims saw color. Muslims saw color. Arabs did, Africans did, everybody did. It's not like they didn't see visible differences of complexion. And they used the term black and they used the term white when they talked about Africa. And they called Europeans red and they called Europeans yellow. You know, you had medieval Arab geographers that had names for the north and south of Africa. They had the south was Bilad al-Sudan, land of the blacks, and the north was Bilad al-Bidan, the land of the whites. That's how they split up the continent in their thinking. So anyone who hears that, I know what you're going to try to do. I know how you're going to try to twist it, how you're going to try to interpret it. You'll do it the same way. Yeah, this is what the British did when they got hold of those classical demarcations of Arab geographers. They did what they always do. As if naming a color is the same thing as assigning a rank in humanity on the basis of that color. No. See, like I said, you have to understand something about how the West processes difference, how they actually process difference between people. Because this is a Western problem, not a human problem, not a universal problem. It's a Western problem. Because in Western history, the moment that you start classifying people by color, that process leads inevitably, reliably, and obviously historically, to hierarchy, to exclusion, to violence. That's the specific documented mechanism of how race was constructed there in the first place. You understand? It was built as a hierarchy from the outstart. A scientific sounding justification for a system of oppression, a system of dehumanization that they had already built and that they were already, that was ongoing for them. And they just needed a way to justify it, pseudo-scientifically. So in the Western mind, seeing color and naming color are treated as the same thing as ranking by color. That's their history. But it's not a universal law of how human beings process difference. It's not our history, and I think it's not the history of most people around the world. I mean, look at like the way that the Arabs used it, how they actually meant it, and how it was actually used. Sudan comes from the Arabic word for black, aswad, the word aswad, like the black stone in the Kaaba. It's purely descriptive. It's a purely descriptive word with no ranking or hierarchical meaning attached to it whatsoever. See, you had a 9th century writer, Al-Jahiz, and he was himself of both Arab and African descent himself. And he wrote a very famous text called Fakhr al-Sudan ala al-Bidan, which is like the boast of the dark-skinned people over the light-skinned people, which was all about celebrating the qualities and the achievements and celebrating the accomplishments and the noting the virtues of dark-skinned people and measuring them favorably against everyone else. That's not a hierarchy, by the way. That's not ranking. That's just this writer, Al-Jahiz, observing that some people from certain regions and certain backgrounds had become collectively known for having certain virtues and certain qualities. It's just like how there's that trope, there's that trope, or you can say it's maybe an axiom almost, that white parents apparently tell their kids. They tell their kids, if you're outside and someone is bothering you or someone is scaring you and you can't find me, well, you go and find a black woman. She'll help you. She'll protect you. You'll be safe with her. She'll make sure you're okay. You see, it's just a recognition that any particular qawm, a grouping of people, a qawm with a shared background tend to also have shared traits. It's logical. And this wasn't a label, by the way, that the West African empires had imposed upon them from the outside, from, externally. It was a self-description. You had a historian from Timbuktu, Abdurrahman as-Sadi. He wrote a chronicle of his civilization's history, and he called it Tarikh as-Sudan, the history of the land of the blacks. You see, this is an African scholar writing the history of his own, the empire that he lived in and came from, and choosing that name for it proudly. It's like, I'm black and I'm proud. Well, they were doing that in the Muslim world centuries ago, writing about a great Islamic civilization in Africa. So I'm saying this to clarify because I have seen here and there over the course of time, not so much lately, but I've seen people talking about that. They're talking about the use of the term black, aswad, in Arabic, as if it indicates racism. I mean, think about what you yourselves accept. Think about what you yourselves accept without a second thought right now in your own country, right? Black neighborhoods, black churches, black owned businesses, the black struggle, Black History Month, and so forth. Now, of course, the reality is that being designated as black in America or in the West generally, that already comes with the context or within the context of racial hierarchy, Western racial hierarchy and white supremacy. So it's never been a term or a designation that wasn't loaded already with that history and that experience of hierarchy and subjugation. And again, this is why you think that the term must always carry that same legacy and that same meaning anytime anyone else uses it anywhere around the world and at any point in history. So you can have an Arab geographer from the 13th century or a Timbuktu scholar from the Songhai Empire writing about his own people's history with pride and using the term black with pride if he describes a place by color, by the color of the people who live in that place, like Bilad al-Sudan, and that's supposed to be now interpreted as proof of some sort of an ancient racial hierarchy. But no, obviously that's foolish. Obviously that's foolishness. And it only works as an accusation if you assume in advance that any culture anywhere and any culture in history that ever so much as noticed color must have meant it the way that your culture meant it. But that's not our history. That's projection. And frankly, it's a little bit arrogant. It's a little bit arrogant to assume that the entire rest of the world has always secretly been thinking about color exactly the way Westerners think about color. No, it's ludicrous. And like I said, it wasn't just Bilad al-Sudan and Bilad al-Bidan. There was a whole sort of color shorthand that the Arabs used for describing people and to delineate regions. So if you just want to look at the black mention, then this is very unfair. They used to call the Byzantines, the Romans, the ones who came from Constantinople and who were in North Africa, they called them Bani al-Asfar, sons of yellow, sons of yellow. There's a hadith in Sahih Bukhari where Rasulullah ﷺ describes them this way, refers to them this way, Bani al-Asfar. He was talking about that there was going to come a time when there was going to be a truce with them. And there's nothing racist about it, you understand? It was just how the Byzantines were referred to. That's just how they talked about them. Bani al-Asfar, yellow people. That wasn't hate speech against Europeans, and it didn't imply any preference for Europeans. There's no hierarchy in there. It was just a descriptive term. It was just a descriptive label referencing complexion to signal or signify where a people come from or what region you're talking about. They used to say ahmar as well for non-Arab people, like for Persians and for Romans and for Slavic people. They call them ahmar, which is red. So they called them red. So like the paler, sort of ruddier complexion populations to the north and to the east of the Arabs, they would call them red. I mean, look at me. I'm more red than I am white. Imam al-Dhahabi said that red, when the Arabs say red back in the day, that meant pale-skinned people. When he said that if you see a hadith that refers to the red people, it usually means the Persians or any other non-Arab people who are known for being pale and sort of ruddy, having ruddy complexions, because that's their predominant coloring. While brown and dark brown tones, that's what the Arabs' predominant coloration was. Ibn al-Athir said the same thing in his own hadith commentary. In fact, he said that black actually refers to the Arabs themselves. Aswad refers to the Arabs themselves because their own complexion runs towards the darker range, and red refers to the non-Arab people, because white and ruddy tones is what predominates among them. You understand? So you see, the Arabs themselves, in their own terminology, saw themselves as being closer to the darker end of the spectrum than to the lighter end of the spectrum. So they weren't like standing outside of this color vocabulary and looking down at everyone else from some assumed position at the top. They were inside of those colors, that what do you call, spectrum of colors. It was a spectrum, not a hierarchy. It's just a descriptive term that they use for everyone else and for themselves. Brown and black for us, the Arabs, is what they would say. Red and yellow for the Persians, for the Byzantines, for the Slavs, for the Europeans. Black for the people of South Sahara. It's just one shorthand system describing what people actually look like, region by region. You understand? With no ranking and no hierarchy built into the vocabulary itself at all. There was no even implication of better or worse. So like I say, it is possible to actually see differences without that seeing of difference necessarily automatically inevitably meaning hierarchy and discrimination and prejudice. It's just recognition. It's just recognition. It's recognition, not racism. And a dark-skinned sub-Saharan African Muslim who is from and who is regarded as and who regards himself as coming from Bilad Sudan was just as much a brother and was just as respected as any Muslim from what's called Bilad al-Bidan, the North Africa. There was nothing derogatory or preferential in either term, just an abbreviated way to signify people from this region or that region. That's all it was. So if you come across it, know what you're looking at. Now again, I'm talking about the Muslims and I'm talking about the Arabs at that time, at the time when the military campaigns occurred against the Byzantines in North Africa. And when the Muslims and the Arabs deepened their relationship and expanded their relationship with Africa 1,300 years ago. Now, today, are there racist Arabs? Sure. Are there Africans who hate Arabs? Sure. Are there individuals who have been infected by Western colonizer paradigms about race? Obviously. Obviously. There are Africans who have been affected by it themselves. There are Africans who've been affected by it themselves, by Western colonizer paradigms about race and their own self-conception and self-loathing in Africa and in the diaspora. You see, the West released a contagion, a pathogen upon the world with these concepts. No one has been immune. No one has been immune. There was no racialization before they created it and spread it across the earth. That's not a thing that existed. Just like I talked about with Sudan or anywhere else. If you see a Sudani who thinks of himself as Arab and a Sudani who thinks of himself as African, and you see those two people fighting, you're not seeing an African fighting an Arab or an Arab fighting an African. You are seeing the West fighting the Muslims through the contagion, through the infection, through the disease of their concepts that they turn brother against brother on the basis of that infection, on the basis of that way of thinking that we never had before. But alhamdulillah, at a civilizational level, I can honestly say, at a civilizational level, collectively, the Muslims have never been like this. And the Muslims are not like this today. I mean, you may find, like I say, you may find individuals, you may find, very specific circumstances where people act like that and people act upon those sorts of concepts. But wallahi, if you tally up the whole history, the whole overarching reality of the ummah, those are anomalies. Those are anomalies. And you need to recognize the source of those mutations. I mean, I already talked about how the British did in India, what the French did, what the Portuguese did, how they created racial and ethnic hierarchies in the lands that they colonized, like in Rwanda, and how these concepts ended up staying in those countries and in the minds of those people even after the colonizers left. In fact, let me stay on that. Let me stay on that for a minute. Because really, the hypocrisy is shameless. The hypocrisy is shameless. If you have a problem with them saying Aswad or using Bilad al-Sudan and so forth, if you're going to take offense at Arabs in Arabic using the term black as a descriptor for sub-Saharan Africans, and you're going to turn that supposedly into some kind of an evidence of racism 1,000 years ago, while, as I say, ignoring the fact that they refer to themselves as black and refer to themselves as brown and refer to pale complexion people as either red or as yellow, and all of these types of terms were just easy recognizable descriptors. They carried no sort of assertion of superiority or inferiority. It was always just sort of incidental information for the purpose of convenience of recognition, say. And again, this is important to explain, although it shouldn't be necessary to explain, but because you're dealing with Westerners here, you have to explain it. These are not identities. Bani Asfar isn't an identity. No one ever understood these things as identities. Bilad al-Sudan, this isn't an identity. No one understood these things as so-called races. That's a pseudoscience that you all came up with. Nobody thought like that back in the day, back before you infected everyone's minds. I mean, like I said before, the so-called white race, the so-called black race, these are fabrications. There's no such thing as a white race or a black race. There's just people on the earth who look different. And our scholars, Islamic scholars, understood centuries ago that this just had to do with adaptation to environment, adaptation to climate, and so on. You understand? It had nothing to do with some sort of ranking of inherent biological level of humanness. You understand? So when the Arabs would say black, or they would say white, or they would say red, or they would say yellow, nobody understood those as different categories of human being. You understand? Different levels of human being. But if you want to spin that, if you want to maliciously interpret that descriptive labeling as racism, wallahi, you are shamelessly hypocritical. Shamelessly hypocritical. Because what do you all teach right now in your schools? What do you all teach right now in your universities? And remember, when we're talking about Bilad al-Sudan and Bilad al-Bidan, we're talking about like the 9th century here. You know? We're not talking about the so-called modern era. We're not talking about just a few years back, a couple of decades ago. We're talking about 1,000 years ago. But what about what you're teaching right now? What about what you're teaching right now in your schools and your universities? Don't you teach Darwin? Don't you teach Darwin? Don't you teach evolution? Well, that's a pseudoscience. Wallahi, that's a pseudoscience. Yes, I said it. It's a pseudoscience. Do you even know the full title of Darwin's book, by the way? Origin of Species? The actual title is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Favored races. That's your man. That's your Darwin. And that's 1859, not 859. So, okay, the Arabs 1,000 years ago, they were using terms like Sudan, Bidan, Asfar, Ahmar, using complexion descriptors and applied evenly with no hierarchy anywhere in it. Nowhere in there was a hierarchy. But look at what your most celebrated minds, what they were writing about and what they were teaching about with regards to Africans just yesterday. You understand? Just during the same time period when your armies and your missionaries were carving up the continent of Africa. Do you understand me? We're not talking about fringe alt-right trolls here. We're talking about your most respected figures, not obscure people. These are the people who you still teach today, who you still treat today with reverence in Western universities. Right now, today. You understand? Start with, what's his name? The Swedish, Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish biologist. Your great father of modern biological classification and taxonomy. Every scientist on Earth until now still uses his naming system. In 1735, he didn't just stop with cataloging plants and animals. No, he divided human beings. He divided human beings up into 4 categories by continent and by color. That's you coming up with race. That's you coming up with race. And he attached innate characteristics to each category of so-called race. Now, before you get it twisted, no, this isn't like Al-Jahiz writing about the virtues of dark-skinned people in Fakhr al-Sudan al-Bidan. This isn't the same thing. I told you he was praising about dark-skinned people or boasting about dark-skinned people, about their virtues and their accomplishments. This was not presented as science. That wasn't presented as biology. You understand me? Nobody read that as some sort of, as I say, a permanent taxonomy, a natural taxonomy. It was just praise. It was just praise for a people, celebration of a people. That's all that was. But that's not what your man was doing. That's not what Linnaeus was doing. He was saying that this and that category of human being was biologically designed like this, innately to have these qualities and characteristics. Before they had they came up with the completely arbitrary category of Caucasian, Linnaeus called them Europeanness, which watch the spelling on that, Europeanness. He said that the Europeanness species is by nature smart, inventive, and governed by law. And then he said that another species was the Africanus, which was phlegmatic, relaxed, negligent, and governed by impulse. That's what he said. This is the foundational document of Western biological science, Western biological study. He built a permanent ranking of human character directly into the taxonomy. European scientists built on top of it without blinking an eye. Because of course they did. You were on top. You were on top by default. And then you've got your Friedrich Hegel, right? Until now, you call him one of the most, one of the two or three top most important philosophers that the West ever produced. Hegel. That's still required reading in any philosophy department anywhere in Europe or in the United States, North America. You got to read Hegel. His lectures on the philosophy of history in the 1830s. Hegel said point blank, he said that Africa is no historical part of the world. It has no movement, it has no development whatsoever to exhibit. That's what he said. You understand? According to Hegel, Germans were on the top. Germans were at the top because, of course, obviously, Germans are at the top. The only ones capable of real reason. Asians are in the middle, and African and indigenous people of the Americas, Native Americans, he said they're at the very bottom. He said they're stuck there at the lowest stage of consciousness there is in the human species, saying that they have no capacity for the reason, self-awareness that Europeans have. Europeans alone. Huh. You have those idiots, by the way, you have those idiots today, right now, who are saying that, like, the Egyptians could never have built the pyramids. And anytime there's any sort of an astonishing civilization or any astonishing accomplishment in Africa or anywhere else in the global south, nowadays they'll say aliens had to have done it. It must have been aliens. Well, that's what Hegel was doing all the way back then. That's what Hegel was doing all the way back then. He said that the Egyptian civilization, you can't count that as an African civilization, he said. He said it doesn't count because Egypt had been settled by so-called light-skinned Semites. That's what he said. They did the same thing about Zimbabwe. If you know, you know. Always denying what non-Westerners did, what non-Westerners accomplished. Because if you acknowledge it, well, that's very inconvenient to the racial supremacy narrative that you like to pretend is science. It messes your whole theory up. Just watch. I'm telling you, the next step for these people is to say the white people themselves are actually advanced intelligence from another planet. That's the next step. That's the next step. That's the logical progression of where this goes. It's just going to be a matter of time before they decide that they're the ones who came down from outer space themselves. And it turns out it was them all along. When they say that some sort of advanced life form must have come down and built the pyramids from outer space, it's just going to be a matter of time before they say that, before they decided that it was them. They're the ones who actually came down from outer space. And oh my gosh, this great revelation, this great epiphany, white people are advanced intelligence from outer space. They're going to say it was them all along. It was always the white people coming from Mars, where Elon is going to go back to. And then, like I said, Darwin, in his own book, The Descent of Man, 1871, look at what your quack of a scientist said. At that time, he was trying to convince people about his theory of evolution. He was trying to convince people about his foolishness, but people still didn't buy it. See, it hadn't become orthodoxy yet. And it became orthodoxy only because, in my opinion, because it served the pre-existing and ever-present self-supremacy narrative, the white supremacy narrative. And once it becomes orthodoxy, well, then you can't question it. Like now. Now you can't question it because everyone is invested in it. And you're able to uphold it by just vilifying anyone who requires it to actually be proven. But back at that time, there were still people who were poking holes in his theory. And they said, okay, Darwin, you say that humans were evolved from lower life forms, but where's the in-between? Where's the missing link? You've got this huge unexplained distance between ape and man, and there's nothing filling it. And nothing ever has filled it, by the way. That missing link was never found. Darwin just shrugged it off. He said gaps like that happen everywhere in nature. No big deal. You got whole branches of family trees that die off over time. Just don't make too big of a thing about it. Don't read too much into it. This is a normal thing that happens. But then he went on to say, Darwin, he said, the closest human beings to an ape, he said, are the Negro and the Aborigines. And the closest ape to a human, he said, is the gorilla. You understand? This is Darwin. This is your man. He said black people and Aborigines people in Australia are basically the closest thing to a missing link between human beings and apes. According to Darwin, that's your man. You're teaching him until now as science. And he said also, he said in the future, he said the near future, you're going to see the measurement is going to change and the distance is going to grow between the most evolved humans, we know who he meant, and the least evolved apes. In other words, everything in between the most evolved humans and the least evolved apes, everything else is going to go extinct. It's going to be eliminated. This is him explaining to you why you can't find the missing evolutionary stages of development in the archaeological record, because only the best survive. Everything else just vanishes. So everything that's lower than the survival of the fittest, everything lower than that just dies out. That's his answer. So he says that the so-called civilized races, this is quoting him, are almost certainly going to exterminate and replace the so-called savage races. And you wonder why Darwinism and evolution caught on in the West. He's literally writing this at the same time when colonization and chattel slavery were in full force. He's writing this at the same time. And in that same sentence, in his book, in that same sentence, he says that gorillas will probably also go extinct. They'll go extinct too. So once the people he calls savage, once those people are gone and the gorillas are gone, then the only measure that the gap is going to be, there's going to be a future human that's more advanced. He said even more advanced than what he calls the Caucasian, meaning that right now in the present day, in his own thinking, his own measurement, the Caucasian is already the standard. The Caucasian is the standard for the most evolved, the most advanced, the highest form of human being there is. White people, according to Darwin, your guy, they're the standard that something would have to beat in order to count as being higher than that. You understand? And on the other end of that, you have like a baboon, the lowest end of the apes. You understand? Darwin, your Darwin. He's basically saying that all so-called non-white people fall somewhere in between fully evolved human beings, which are white people, and baboons. And you still try to pass this off as science until now. And I mean, just forget about his casually genocidal opinion that they're going to be exterminated, and it should be. How's that playing out? How's that prediction playing out? Who's going extinct? And this is your man. Like I say, this is your man. This is your founder of your pseudo-scientific evolutionary biology. Still taught with total reverence in every serious university in the West and in the colonized world. His name gets attached to entire schools of thought. His portrait hangs in the halls of science. They have statues of this man like he's a saint. We're not talking about the drunk scribblings of some plantation overseer, scribbling nonsense that nobody ever respected. This is the top Western intellectual achievement. Writing down as established science, scientific reasoning, saying that black people and Aboriginal people were his present day marker for being the closest human being to an ape, and that their disappearance from the earth was not only coming and was not only expected, but it's what nature demanded. No, it's scribbling nonsense. It's absolute nonsense pseudoscience. So you've got your father of biological classification, Linnaeus. You've got your one of your most revered philosophers, Hegel, and you've got this raving lunatic founder of your evolutionary pseudoscience, Charles Darwin. And each one of those men blatantly pushing white supremacy and blatantly pushing the total dehumanization of Africans. At the same time, coincidentally, that their governments were at that very moment carving up the lands of the people that they were calling savage, that they were calling subhuman, that they were calling destined for extermination by the more advanced, more civilized races. See, that's the theory that your so-called civilization, used to explain to itself why it was allowed to do what it was doing. I mean, ask yourself, what kind of a so-called civilization does that? It builds a statue to men like that. And then ask yourself, why would such a civilization, a so-called civilization like that, what possible interest would they have in trying to make you think that the real history of racism and racial hierarchy and racial discrimination and prejudice and bigotry, why do you think that they would like you to think that that history is someone else's history and not theirs? And listen, also, like I said before, and repeated many times, no one is saying that the African Muslims who were ruling in Africa following the military campaigns, because that's what you had, not Arabs, Africans, indigenous Africans, that were ruling after the military campaigns or ruling as a result of Islam spreading in their lands. No one is saying that they were perfect and that they were only and always upright and good and pious and decent and so on, and just and fair. No, Islam is not a religion of perfect people. Islam is not a religion for malaika, for angels. Islam is a religion that if we follow it, if we refer to it, if we adhere to it as best as we can, it can teach us how to minimize our own imperfections. And it can help us to navigate imperfect circumstances and situations for better outcomes. You understand? And hopefully prevent us from being overtaken by our own imperfections. We just do our best. We do our best and we try to opt for whatever is better, whatever is closer to the truth in any given situation, any given set of circumstances, according to whatever the available options are. And sometimes we will succeed in that and sometimes we will fail in that. We're just human. So for example, I'll give you two cases. There are two cases that I'll mention because they involve fighting. It involves fighting, violence between African Muslims and other African Muslims. And there's also non-Muslim African Muslims involved in one of these cases. So this is Africans fighting Africans, not a foreign occupier like against the Byzantines. And I'm only mentioning these examples because I want to give you an accurate picture and show you that we're trying to give an accurate picture. Because like I said, we don't have to spin anything. We don't have to leave anything out in the history. We don't have to cherry pick. We don't have to mythologize. We don't have to do that. You understand me? We're not trying to weave together a picture of Islam in Africa that is utopian. No, we're not like that. We're not interested in that. And anyone who does something like that, whether it's about Islam or about anything else, you should know that that's someone who is dishonest. That's a dishonest person. And they're lying to you. So for Muslims, I'll just tell you, don't make the mistake of this. Don't make the mistake of doing this just because that's what Westerners are doing to us. You don't get to do that. You don't, they cherry pick, they lie, they distort, they leave things out, they leave out context, they mythologize, they utopianize their own history, right? And they dystopianize our history. But don't get provoked. Don't let yourself get provoked. You understand me? See, they want to create a distorted version of Muslim history in Africa to make it look like our history in Africa is as bad as theirs or worse than theirs. So they lie and they misrepresent, mischaracterize, misinterpret, and so on. And you could very easily let yourself get provoked into doing the exact same thing as them, except in the opposite direction, and try to present a picture of Islam in Africa that makes it look idyllic, that makes it look utopian, and so forth. Only wonderful things happened. No, that's not what we do. You understand me? You don't counter malicious dishonesty with defensive dishonesty. You counter it with honesty, period. And alhamdulillah, our ummah, over the course of history, has conducted itself in such a way that we truly have nothing to fear from an honest accounting. Alhamdulillah. Which is not the same as saying that we never made mistakes. It's not the same as saying that we only ever made right decisions. No. It's not the same as saying that every single Muslim in Africa was uniformly fair, was uniformly just, and was uniformly as good as the best amongst us. No. And anyone who pretends that that's supposed to be the standard that we're supposed to meet, that this standard of perfection is what we have to meet. Anyone who is demanding that's not a good faith actor. Understand me, I'm doing two things here with this series. I'm correcting the lies and the misinformation that's creating a false version of history, and I'm making a comparison. And in that comparison, the standard that we are measured against is you, the West, not perfection. And measured against your history, anyone with any integrity or sincerity towards the truth, no one could ever possibly deny that the history of Muslims in Africa, the history of Islam in Africa, is quantifiably and qualitatively superior to the history of the West in Africa. No question about it. No, we don't have to make anything up. We don't have to leave anything out. Because the objective truth is that Islam has been a net positive for the continent. It's been a net positive for the continent, for the people. And the objective truth is that the Muslims and what the Muslims built in Africa, again, almost entirely by indigenous African Muslims, not Arabs, not anybody else, what they built was better than what preceded it, and it was immeasurably better than what was done by the colonizers. So I've mentioned before the Sokoto Khilafah. The Sokoto Khilafah. This was established by a very brilliant Islamic scholar from what is now known as northern Nigeria, Uthman Danfodio, in the early 1800s. In the early 1800s, he launched an armed confrontation that he called a jihad against Hausa rulers who were themselves nominally Muslim, and he accused them of overtaxation, taxing the people, extorting their subjects unjustly, and he accused them of mixing genuine Islamic governance with corruption. So there you have an example. At that time, at his time, there were Muslim rulers who were not doing right. So this conflict, this confrontation that he led was, you can say, a reform movement against other Muslims who were accused of governing badly, governing corruptly. This was not a war against outsiders to try to seize their land. You understand me? So that was one situation that occurred where there was violence and there was force that was used to unseat African rulers, but that was by other Africans, and it was between Muslims. This is between Muslims. And it was on the basis of ending corruption and ending oppression. So that tells you that yes, corruption and oppression existed amongst African rulers. And in this case, alhamdulillah, it was put in check. It was put in check by another African Muslim ruler. And that led to the Sokoto Khilafah. And if you don't know what is the Sokoto Khilafah, or maybe you only know about whatever regarding the Sokoto Khilafah is convenient for Western narratives, you need to know it was a remarkable civilizational achievement. By 1837, you're talking about barely a generation after Danfodio, Uthman Danfodio, had first led that movement against the corruption. The Sokoto Khilafah had grown to somewhere between 10 to 20 million people. There was like 10 to 20 million people there. Think about that. That was the most populous state anywhere in West Africa. And by most honest counts, it was even one of the largest empires on the face of the earth at that particular moment in history. In terms of population, it was bigger in raw numbers than most of the kingdoms in Europe at that time. Even Western historians had to admit that the Sokoto Khilafah was the most developed state of pre-modern sub-Saharan Africa. A British academic said that. You had more than 30 different separate emirates, spread across a territory that today is 4 different countries: Nigeria, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Cameroon. All bound together under one single religious authority. One single, they all had their own functioning Islamic courts. They all had their own standardized approach to law, their own standardized approach to governance and administration and so forth. Instead of having 30 different, individual rulers doing whatever they pleased in their little jurisdiction. I mean, look at that. Alhamdulillah, look at that. Islam brought that. Islam brought that unification. Islam brought that unity. What the colonizers, when they came, they turned that into 4 different countries. What the Muslims had unified under one indigenous khilafah, they broke up into 4 countries at the Berlin Conference. I mean, I don't mean to get distracted, but it is important, I think. It's important to highlight the difference here between what they did and what we did. In the late 1880s, you had that Berlin Conference in Europe, where you had the European powers, and they came together. They agreed upon something called the principle of effective occupation, which meant that basically whoever got to a territory first and planted their flag first, well, you got first dibs on it. You got to claim it for yourself first, regardless of whatever political or religious or linguistic or tribal community was there before that had been governing that land before for generations upon generations. It doesn't matter. The people on the land don't matter. It's ours now. We put our flag on it. Khalas. You had arbitrary borders being drawn by men in European conference rooms who never even set foot on the ground that they were dividing. Never even set foot. So Germany and Britain fought over one of the Sokoto emirates, and they sliced it in half, one of the biggest ones. So it was swallowed up, part of it, half of it was swallowed up into British-controlled Nigeria, the other half went to German Cameroon. Then you had the Bornu region that was right next door, and that also got split the same way between British and German administration. Dividing a population, you understand me? They're dividing a population that had been unified under one governance system for generations, for 99 years. By the time the colonizers were done with it, the entire Khilafah, the entire Sokoto Khilafah, one unified political and religious indigenous structure that had been sovereign for 99 years, basically a century, got carved into pieces and handed out to the British, to the French, and to the Germans, according to whatever they reflected their own interests. Had nothing to do with the civilization or the population or the people that were there and what their interests were, or what their relationships were. And you see that pattern over and over and over again across the entire continent. Colonial borders being drawn between European powers to settle disputes between them so they wouldn't fight about who got what land. You understand me? Not to reflect the actual relationships on the ground between the people. The relationships of African political and cultural life on the ground by the people whose land it actually is. Families, trade networks, religious authorities. You had entire emirates, entire states that had functioned cohesively as a single entity for a century. They found themselves overnight split apart, broken apart across a line or divided by a line that had been agreed by people in Berlin who never even went there, who never even set foot in the place. That is the deliberate fracturing of indigenous civilizational power structures that they had built themselves and maintained coherently over generations, being divided apart by borders. The only purpose of those borders was to keep the European powers from fighting each other over who got what part of land. Zero regard for the people there. But look at what the Muslims had built. Look at what the Muslims had built that they broke apart. That the Muslims themselves, Africans built this themselves. Uthman Danfodio, his brother Abdullah, and his son Muhammad, just these three men, they, between them, produced 300 books on theology, on law, on government, on ethics, and so on. 300 books coming out of just three men from a state that Western textbooks will tell you was a jungle. Western textbooks will tell you it was a jungle, it was primitive, it was uncivilized, they're savages. And then you have his own daughter, Uthman Danfodio's daughter, Nana Asma'u. She built something that you won't find a parallel to this anywhere on the continent in that period of time. In fact, at that period of time, I don't think you'll find anything like this on earth. She organized the whole corps of trained, traveling female teachers who would carry Islamic education directly to women, directly to Muslim women in the cities and all the way out in the rural countryside. You're talking about this is a period of time when no one was doing anything like that anywhere on the planet. Organizing, systematic education for women. She was a scholar, she was a poet in her own right, she could write in Arabic, she could write in multiple languages, in Hausa, and her name is still invoked today, right now, by Islamic women's organizations across northern Nigeria. This is a very important woman. May Allah bless her and grant her Jannah. This is the Sokoto Khilafah. This is what they built. Now put that next to what actually, what they replaced, when the Sokoto Khilafah, what they replaced. The House of States that Danfodio rose up against. They want some innocent, untouched pre-colonial paradise, you understand? That they didn't dethrone a utopia. By their own subjects' accounts, this was they were arbitrarily extortionate against their people. They dressed up their own personal greed in the language of Islam, the language of religion. They taxed people into the ground. Now it was corrupt. See, that was the actual complaint. That was Danfodio's complaint. That was the actual justification for rising up against them. Now measure that against that specific complaint, measure that up against what the Sokoto Khilafah actually delivered. They delivered exactly what they promised. A codified law instead of a ruler's whim. You had a functioning court system. You had education reaching further into the population than it ever had before, including for the first time systematically for women. Okay, so that's what they replaced. That's what the Sokoto Khilafah replaced. So what replaced the Sokoto Khilafah? Colonization. In 1903, British troops came in and they killed the reigning sultan of the Sokoto Khilafah, and they ended a century of indigenous sovereignty through massacre, followed by total pillage, total plunder, as usual, ruthless extraction. I mean, look, you could, any given example of any land, you could do a whole series on each one, on each land, to actually, you need a whole series to actually describe what the British did in Nigeria, in Sudan, in Kenya, in country after country after country. But for now, you just need to know that the Sokoto Khilafah was a century of genuine indigenous sovereignty, African rule, African law, African scholarship, the most developed state in so-called pre-modern sub-Saharan Africa that had ever been built by African Muslims, indigenous African Muslims, specifically to correct African Muslims who had become corrupt. You understand? Not an Arab in sight. This was entirely an African Muslim civilization. Again, I'm not saying it was perfect. But it was definitely better than what preceded it. And it was definitely better than what followed it, without question. And then you had a similar incident. This is the other one I wanted to talk about. A similar conflict. So a few years after Uthman Danfodio, and a few hundred miles away, west of Sokoto, in what's now central Mali. At that time, this region was dominated by what was called the Bambara Empire. It was a very powerful non-Muslim state that practiced traditional African beliefs, animist beliefs, not Islam, not Christianity, not anything like that. And you had the Muslim Fulani cattle herders, and you had the whole Muslim community. They were all living under this non-Muslim Bambara animist political dominance. So there was a Fulani sheikh, a Sufi, a Qadriya scholar named Seko Amadou, and he saw that both the Bambara rulers themselves and much of the Fulani Muslim leadership, the Muslim elites, they were completely failing the people that they govern. I mean, again, I don't want to get sidetracked. It's a complex history. Like I say, with any one of these examples, you could do a whole series. But basically what we're talking about is a Muslim majority region, under non-Muslim rule, for no other reason than that non-Muslim rule was militarily stronger. And they ruled through a system very similar to the British colonial system, the Western colonial model of indirect rule, through collaborators. They used collaborators, basically. The elites were collaborators. They benefited from cooperating with the Bambara rulers, and they watered down Islam, they compromised, they diluted the deen and so forth for their own self-serving reasons. You understand me? This is something that you see is very common. We see it all the time. So again, this is an example of Muslims failing. Those collaborators were failing. And part of this even goes back to what the Moroccans did. Because when the Moroccans invaded the Songhai Empire, that weakened the empire, and that had negative repercussions across the region. This wouldn't have happened, this led to the Bambara Empire gaining dominion over the Muslim majority there. That wouldn't have happened. It's because the Moroccans did what they did. If Morocco had not invaded the Songhai Empire, this wouldn't have happened. So there's many things, obviously. Like I say, it's a continuum of events. So then in 1818, Seko Amadou declares jihad. So you have an example here of African Muslims fighting against African non-Muslims, including their Muslim collaborators. Justifiable reasons, in my opinion. Again, no Arab in sight. He defeated the Bambara, and he defeated the Muslim collaborators. And just to tell you how the local population received him, when he entered Janneh, the city's own established scholars did not resist him. They welcomed him. The people welcomed him. His campaign was viewed by the people as bringing the reforms that they needed, and it got rid of the obsequious Muslim collaborator elites that they wanted to be gotten rid of. You understand me? Collaborating with the kuffar. When Seko Amadou entered Janneh, the capital, he didn't want to rule from there. He built a whole new city, Hamdallahi, and he governed from there, and that became known as the Messina Empire. He built, I think, 600 or more than 600 Quranic schools. He established a formal welfare system that provided for the widows, provided for the orphans, provided for the poor. And he governed, this is the other thing, he governed through a shura, a grand council of roughly 100 scholars. Understand? By shura. He wasn't running it on his personal dictates. He had the power to do it. He could have done it. That's what everybody else did. That's not what he did. All of the legal rulings, the religious rulings, all of this was a product of consultation and precedent, not his own hubris as the ruler, not individual dictate. You understand me? So I mention this case because it does show that there were corrupt African Muslim rulers and collaborators. There were Muslims who didn't take the religion seriously. There were Muslims who compromised. And they were, at least in these cases, alhamdulillah, corrected by other Muslims. You understand me? The fight of Seko Amadou was against African non-Muslims, yes, but also against the corrupt Muslim elites, the collaborators. But again, it was on the basis of misrule and immorality and oppression and corruption and so forth. And what he built, again, what he built after gaining power was definitely something that was better than what it replaced. So yes, fighting happened, conflicts happen, disputes happen, yes, rebellions happen, infighting, internecine fighting, what have you. These things happen, usually between indigenous African Muslim powers, sometimes between African Muslim powers and African non-Muslim powers. But that's exactly what they were. That's what we're talking about. These were all indigenous conflicts being engaged in by indigenous African powers, Muslim and Muslim, or Muslim and non-Muslim. Now, would the Bambara Empire agree that what happened was right? Probably not. Would the corrupt Muslim leaders that Othman Danfodio defeated, would they agree that it was right? Probably not. But you can't call it colonization. That's my point. You can't call it colonization unless you want to pretend that by being Muslim, that means that you're a foreigner in your own land. And anyway, like I said, in both of these examples, we're talking about Muslim majority populations anyway. You understand me? So certainly you can't accuse this of having any element of trying to force conversion on anyone. Everybody was Muslim already. But also you have to bear in mind that most of these conflicts happen, but they were not frequent. And they do not at all represent the norm. You understand me? I mean, you could look at the East Coast, the African East Coast was now Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, and so forth. No, Islam spread organically there, just like in most of Africa, over the course of centuries, over the course of the Indian trade, the Indian Ocean trade networks. No military campaign whatsoever. There was never a military campaign in sub-Saharan Africa. But on the East Coast, no. You had Arab merchants, Indian, Persian, and so forth, coming to the towns on the coast of East Africa. These towns were already thriving commercially on their own or in their own right. And they built, over the course of generations, they produced a whole new African civilization, the Swahili civilization. That's how that was built. With their own language that blends Bantu and Arabic. You've got Arabic vocabulary woven into it, same as Hausa. Swahili civilization. They have their own body of literature, their own body of poetry, their own body of scholarship. They have their own city-states, from Mogadishu to Kilwa to Sofala. You understand me? Those cities became wealthy. Those city-states became wealthy. From gold, from ivory, from textile trade, and so forth. They weren't impoverished by colonial extraction because of Muslim conquest. Nobody conquered the Swahili coast for Islam. It built itself over centuries through trade relationships between foreign traders and indigenous African communities and merchants. See, when the Muslims came, when the Arabs came to Africa and they helped the Africans kick out the Byzantines, which is what happened, and when in other parts of Africa, Islam spread, people embraced Islam, these two things happened simultaneously. This did not constitute at all Africa being taken over by an outside power that colonized them and extracted from them and ruled them from Baghdad or from Damascus or from Istanbul. Do you understand me? This is a complete misrepresentation of history. It connected Africa to the global Muslim Ummah, and it integrated Africa into a huge international economy. The relationship was commercial, not extractive. It wasn't utopian, but by any measure, it was better than what preceded it, and by any measure, it was better than what followed it. You understand me? African states grew wealthy as a result of this. They prospered as a result of this. They developed as a result of this. And obviously, again, they self-governed for the first time in 800 years. They kept their cultures, they kept their language. You understand me? Now, how any of this can possibly be described as Arab colonization or as Muslim colonization or Muslim imperialism, I wish I knew. You must be out of your mind. Now put all of that next to the Western colonization, what Western colonization actually did. I mean, by comparison, just look at North Africa for now. Just look at North Africa. You say that the Muslims colonized North Africa. Okay, so let's talk about what the West did. Let's talk about what the West did, what the Europeans did in North Africa. Take Algeria, the French, from 1830 to 1962. France invaded and they stayed for 132 years. Just the conquest phase alone, when the French came through the 1860s, that killed somewhere between 500,000 to 1 million Algerians out of a total population of just 3 million. You understand me? A third of the population was killed by direct warfare or by deliberate destruction of crops, deliberate destruction of villages under a scorched earth total war policy. Disease and starvation. Historians even classify it as a genocide. They say that the conquest of Algeria by the French was a genocide. I mean, you had like I say, a third of the whole population was decimated by the French. Okay, that's what you did. Then you had the French settlers coming in. They confiscated the land. They confiscated the most fertile land in the country. They got rid of any sort of a traditional collective ownership system. They dismantled that. They replaced it with the title system, the European title system, property ownership, deeds and whatnot. You had entire villages being displaced to make way for French, now French farms, French-owned farms, French-owned vineyards, right? Then they formalized in 1881, they put a permanent, separate, legal, inferior status for Algerian Muslims specifically. Arbitrary punishment, forced labor, property confiscation, without trial. You understand me? You couldn't get French citizenship unless you were willing to renounce Islamic personal law. Look at that. You see how they are? How they've always been, how they are until now. Then you had the War of Independence. That was from like 1954, 55 until 1962, finally ended in 1962. And that process, that War of Independence, that led to hundreds of thousands of more deaths. adding hundreds of thousands of more deaths to the French account. They used torture. They used forced displacement. They put people in camps. They used chemical weapons. No, it was horrific. Or the British in Egypt, still North Africa, British in Egypt. I'm surprised. A lot of people don't even know about this, subhanAllah. A lot of people don't even know. I don't know how you don't know. A lot of people don't seem to know that the Middle East and North Africa got colonized by Europe. Got colonized brutally. I don't know, subhanAllah. It's like maybe you hear isolated stories or something, and somehow you separate that in your mind from real lived history of these people, and that they were impacted the same way everyone else was. Like you think that the Arabs were not victims of colonization just like everybody else in the global south? No, they were colonized. They were colonized. They were colonized brutally. They were colonized thoroughly. You understand me? The British were in Egypt from 1882 to 1952. You understand? They first they came in, they invaded to crush a nationalist movement and to try to secure repayment of Egypt's foreign debt to the UK, to Britain. And then they just stayed there for 70 years, maintaining a fiction that Egypt was self-governing. They restructured Egypt's entire agricultural economy around cotton exports for Britain. Cotton exports to their textile mills. You understand? They built irrigation infrastructure that was specifically and exclusively for the purpose of maximizing cotton yield for export rather than for food security for Egyptians. This is what they did everywhere, by the way. This is what they did everywhere. They did the same in Nigeria after they destroyed the Sokoto Khilafah. They forced farmers into single crop agriculture that served their interests, for export, not for the people's own food security, their own food needs. So in Egypt, the governing power was actually with the British so-called advisors. They would tell the Egyptian ministers what to do, regardless of what they wanted to do, regardless of whatever the symbolic national government wanted to do. It didn't matter. You didn't have any power. I'll give you a snapshot. There's an incident that occurred, an incident that happened that I think is sort of representative of how things worked under the British in Egypt. In 1906, you had 5 British officers who went out hunting pigeons. Very British thing to do. They went out hunting pigeons. But listen, what they meant for them, hunting pigeons meant, this is also a very British thing, by the way. Hunting pigeons meant for them going out to a village and shooting the pigeons that the villagers kept in cages. What do you call it? Aviaries? Aviaries? Where they keep like in New York on the rooftops or whatnot, where they keep pigeons. Because for them, the people in Egypt, they eat pigeons. So that's like chickens for them. It's like you're raising chickens. This is food that you're raising to eat. This is like fowl, poultry for you. So the British started shooting at the villagers' pigeon cages, killing the pigeons. And of course, there's grain, there's hay, there's grass, there's nests and whatnot. So it starts a fire. The shooting starts a fire. The grain goes up in flames. Grain that they farmed, grain that they harvested, grain that was their food, up in flames. So the Egyptians, they confront the British officers. They try to make them stop, okay? There's a scuffle. They try to disarm them. Gun goes off. Shoots an Egyptian woman. Okay, so at that point, the villagers just start beating the British officers, as you do. One of the officers tries to run away. He's running. It's like June at this time, full heat of summer. Pale British man running in the full heat of summer in Egypt drops dead of a heat stroke, okay? Died of a heat stroke. British man in Egypt in the summer, you understand? He died of natural causes. You can call that natural causes, or at least you call it predictable causes. But in response to this incident, the colonizers set up a summary tribunal court that convicted dozens of Egyptian villagers, handing down death sentences. Flogging carried out publicly in the village itself, in front of everybody. The hangings out in public. Because the Egyptians were trying to save their own food. They were trying to save their own food supply from being shot or being burned by the British. And because an Egyptian woman got shot, they got punished. 21 men were convicted. 4 men were hanged. 8 men were publicly whipped, 50 times each. The rest of them got prison. The man whose wife is the one who got shot, the man whose wife got shot, he got sentenced to hard labor for life. They made the whole village come out and watch the hangings. You understand? Including the families of the men being hanged. Made them watch. That's what you did. That's what you did. That's you. You understand? We're going to come and shoot up your livestock. We're going to come and shoot up your poultry. We're going to burn your food supply. We're going to shoot your wives. And if you try to do anything about it, we're going to hang you in front of your own children. That's you. That's you. That's your British gentleman. The very model of a modern major general. That's you. And I already talked about the Italians. what you all did to Omar Mukhtar in Libya and to the people of Libya. You set up concentration camps over there, holding 100,000 people or more. There was roughly 80,000 people died in those camps. So it's not concentration camps. No, it's death camps. You set up death camps in the deserts of Libya. Killed 80,000 people. British, French, and Italians. This is what I'm talking about. Colonial campaign of conquest. That's what it really looks like. Extraction, land theft, engineered debt dependency, and in more than one case, mass murder. Carried out entirely by European Christian powers. The Roman Empire Part 3. That's what we're talking about. And of course, they did the same. They did the same and worse against other African populations that had no connection to Islam at all. Because it was about white supremacy. It was about Western supremacy. Domination, control, subjugation, and extraction. As always. I talked before multiple times about the Congo, about the so-called Free State, Congo Free State from 1885 to 1908. That wasn't even a state colony officially at that time. It was literally the personal property of a single Western monarch. Literally his personal property, King Leopold II of Belgium. He ran Congo like it was his own private commercial enterprise. A whole country, a whole land, extracting rubber just for him. So he had a private army, the Force Publique, and they were responsible for the rubber collection quotas, for enforcing those quotas at gunpoint on the villagers. I've talked about this before. But there came a time when the soldiers of the Force Publique were suspected of wasting government-issued ammunition on hunting instead of on enforcement. So they became required to produce a severed human hand for every bullet that they fired as proof that that bullet had been fired at a Congolese and not to hunt an animal, because hunting an animal was unjustified, but hunting a Congolese was justified. So they started bringing baskets full of severed hands, literally as accounting documents, to prove that they weren't misusing their ammunition. Hands cut from the living and the dead alike, from men, women, and children. If a village was considered to have failed to meet the rubber quota, that village got burned. Hostages got taken. The population was completely terrorized into compliance. Just straight up terrorism. Straight up terrorism. At least 10 million, 12 million people killed. Directly by violence, by starvation, by disease. At least 10 million people were killed. Roughly half of that region's population, by the way. That's roughly half of the population in just 2 decades. That's a genocide. I've talked before about the officially the first genocide in the 20th century in southwest Africa, what's now Namibia, by the Germans, the early 1900s, between 1904 and 1908. First genocide officially in the 20th century, and it is directly connected to what the Nazis did 20 years later. The Herero and Nama extermination order, the death march into the desert, the concentration camps that had a mortality rate of over 70%. So that's also death camps, not concentration camps. They did horrific medical experiments. They injected people with arsenic. They sterilized people. In fact, the lead practitioner in those camps, the lead practitioner later on went to become the teacher of Joseph Mengele. They gathered the skulls of their victims, the bones of their victims, to be sent back to Germany for pseudoscientific eugenics type racial study, racial surgery. They made women in the camps scrape the flesh off the skulls of the dead, off the bones of the dead, so it'd be clean for the Germans. You understand me? People that they knew, people that was their friends and their family, scraping the flesh off the bones for the colonizers. See, that's you. That's what you did. That's Western colonization. That's what colonization looks like. If you want to use that word, you better know what you're talking about. No one was sadistic like that but you. I've talked about Kenya before in the 1950s. The 1950s. See, again, think about the time period that we're talking about here. We're not talking about BCE. We're not talking about ancient people. This is you just recently in the so-called modern era. This is you just yesterday. Do you understand me? Now, Kenya, before I even talk about what happened in Kenya, you need to understand it's always the same lie every single time. They always tell the same lie. They'll always tell you that the violence started by the so-called natives, that they started it. They never started it. Just like in Egypt, what you did with those people's pigeons. That was started by the British soldiers, but then you say that they started it. Same as in Gaza. By 1950, over 1.25 million Kikuyu had been squeezed into 7% of Kenya's arable land. 7%. You understand? The rest, all the good land, all the fertile land, all the arable land, the land that the families in Kenya, the Kikuyu, have been working for generations, that got moved off of, that was taken by white people, and they even called it the White Highlands. That was the official, actual name that the British settlers gave the land that they took. The White Highlands. So you understand, before a single Mau Mau fighter ever picked up a weapon, that land confiscation, that land theft had already happened. And this is why the Mau Mau picked up their weapons in the first place. So they rose up. The Mau Mau rose up. And the British response to that uprising, to that self-defense, was to create a killing and subjugation machine. 320,000 people put into torture camps. 320,000 people. Up to 1.5 million people. Basically every single Kikuyu man, woman, and child in the country got locked inside some 800 so-called protective villages. That's what they called it. Protected villages. Means barbed wire, spiked trenches, watchtowers, gun towers, round the clock. Means open air prison. I mean, what would you call that anywhere else in history? What would you have called that anywhere else in the world if it had been done to any other people besides black Africans? That's why I tell you, don't you ever tell me that Hitler was an anomaly among Europeans. And don't you ever tell me that they fought against Hitler because of the Holocaust or because they had any sort of a moral objection to the Nazis or what the Nazis were doing. No, because look, this is the 1950s. You have British soldiers in Kenya, probably who fought against the Nazis themselves in World War II, locking up entire populations in torture camps in Kenya. No, there's no difference between any of you. You all do the same things. You built the same machine in Africa that the Nazis built in Europe. You're no different. You're no different whatsoever. And inside that machine, here's what they did to human beings. There was a 15-year-old girl who got arrested for the crime of cooking and washing clothes for the Mau Mau, right? She was cooking and she was washing their clothes. The British arrested her. They raped her with a bottle full of scalding hot water. That's not me saying it. That's her own sworn testimony decades later in court. Again, just to let you know, we're not talking about ancient history. The survivors are still alive today from what you did. This just happened. She was 15 years old, and she was just one of many. Again, that's you. That's what you did. Deliberately, calculatedly, systematically. Do I even need to talk about South Africa? From like 1913 onward until this morning. The Natives Land Act of 1913 that legally restricted African land ownership, the ownership by Africans to roughly 7% of the country's total land. See, just like in Kenya, same type of thing. Same like they did in Algeria as well. You criminalized for Africans to actually own land anywhere outside of those designated areas. Decades before the word apartheid was ever coined, you did this. That single piece of legislation in 1913, that single piece of legislation became the legal foundation for the entire 20th century, the whole 20th century system of forced removals, migrant labor, racial dispossession, apartheid, everything that followed it. Displacing millions of people from their land that their families had worked for generations, moving them into overcrowded reservations, Bantustans and so forth, designed to supply cheap labor to now white-owned mines, now white-owned farms. Previously, they were yours. You understand? And this is ongoing in South Africa until right now. Like I said, I hope I don't have to tell you about how brutal the apartheid system was. And I hope I don't have to tell you how brutal the unofficial apartheid system still is. Always the same underlying logic with them. Land and resources belong to whoever has the power to take it by force. And whoever happens to be living on that land and has always lived on that land, you're just an obstacle to be either managed or terrorized or eliminated by whatever method proved most efficient. Forget about what's moral. Why, if you dare compare the spread of Islam in Africa to colonization, you are not only insulting the Muslims, you are insulting the millions upon millions of victims of Western colonialism in Africa over the course of the centuries. I mean, let me get back to this issue of extraction, because it's about what each system, the way they approached it, the way we approached it, what each system was structurally built to do. So European colonialism, you should know by now, ran on a ruthlessly calculated system, a ruthlessly calculated model of one-way wealth transfer, an engineered flow so that the wealth and the resources went in one direction only, out of the colony, directly to the imperial hub, to the colonial capital. And this was sustained decade after decade after decade by political and military force and brutality. So cotton from Egypt fed the mills in Manchester. Rubber from Congo fed the fortunes in Brussels and Antwerp. Gold and diamonds that were pulled from the ground in South Africa built London's banking houses. This wasn't a side effect of colonization. This is colonization's entire operating principle. It's the whole point. The colony itself existed according to the system's internal logic, for the exclusive purpose of enriching the imperial hub. And every institution built in the colony, railways running in straight lines from the mine to the port, the way they did the tax systems, forced labor systems, all of this existed to make the extraction more efficient for the imperial hub, for the capital. Everything was designed to make extraction more efficient. They didn't build anything that the colonized population would keep that was for their benefit. No, nothing resembling this exists anywhere in the historical record of Islam's spread through Africa. Not at all. The complete opposite. You understand? The trans-Saharan trade moved goods in both directions. It was two-way. You had gold and other things going from south to north. You had salt, textiles, horses, books, camels, whatnot going north to south. Genuine exchange. Not one-way extraction enforced by violence. Western colonizers, like I said, they forced African farmers into those single cash crops for export. Deliberately, calculatedly wrecking the local food self-sufficiency in the process. But there's no equivalent to that in the history of Islam in Africa. No single cash crop policy anywhere in the record of African Muslim states. No, they built their trade with each other according to whatever mix of goods, whatever mix of regional agriculture and produce, craftsmanship and so on, that they already had going, that they already produced, what they already made. If you make this, then we make this, let's see if we can trade. Not, this is what you have to make because this is what I want. That was what you did. And like I said, the infrastructure that you made in the colonies, like the railways, that ran point to point, from extraction point to the port, to just move the things out. Nowhere else. Infrastructure had no other purpose. Nothing that you built had any other purpose beyond moving wealth and resources out. All the infrastructure that you ever built was for your own selfish interests. But look at the trans-Saharan caravan routes. Cities grew up alongside of those. That was built for ongoing two-way commerce. And it kept being used by the people who built them. They kept using it long after this empire rose and fell or that empire rose and fell. You understand me? All of the infrastructure was yours. It's indigenous infrastructure built for you to keep. And like I say, at no point in no chapter of Islamic African history will you ever find anything that even remotely approaches the demographic catastrophe of Leopold's Congo or German Namibia. 10 million dead in one case, 75 to 90% of the entire population destroyed in the other case. You understand me? A third of the population of Algeria killed by the French. Populations in torture camps in Kenya. Nothing in our history comes anywhere close to those atrocities. Never. And again, this isn't even you 1,000 years ago. Like I say, this is you yesterday. And truth be told, this is you right now. There's no change. No, there's no honest comparison. You can't make an honest comparison between us. This isn't two versions of the same story. You know, two versions of the same story, one being carried out by Westerners, one being carried out by Muslims. No, this is two extremely different stories, two extremely different projects. If you just judge by the internal logic that was involved and by the impact that was had upon the people, no, on the one hand, you had a so-called civilization that was taking a continent's wealth and resources by force, by terror, by racist violence and sadistic violence, siphoning off their wealth and resources for centuries out of the country to the imperial hub, leaving them with nothing. And on the other hand, you have a civilization that helped countries build themselves up, build their own empires, build their own power structures, rule themselves indigenously, become independently, autonomously powerful and prosperous and wealthy, educated, developed. You understand me? The Muslims never even built that type of machinery of extraction. They built infrastructure for the people who live there because it wasn't even outsiders building it. You understand me? This is the thing that you have to get through your head. When you talk about Muslims in Africa, you're talking about Africans in Africa, building for themselves, doing for themselves, ruling themselves. Now, you can't compare the spread of Islam in Africa and Muslim rule in Africa. You can't compare that to Western colonization in Africa at all. If you compare those two things and it makes sense in your mind, then it also makes sense in your mind that if I take money from my pocket and buy something, it's the same as you taking money from my pocket and buying something. Okay, so let's review. Let's review what we've talked about so far, because we've covered the colonialism, imperialism false narrative about Muslims in Africa, the false racism narrative about Muslims in Africa. And inshallah, next we're going to talk about slavery in Africa, because that's another issue, obviously, that gets completely misrepresented and distorted And inshallah, bi'idhnillah, we're going to break it down, as always, objectively, honestly, fairly, without any spin or without any narrative laundering whatsoever. But I just want to make sure that that everything that we've talked about so far, I want to make sure that it's all crystal clear in your mind. You understand? I want to make sure that you fully understand just how absurd it is and how offensive it is for you to let the West get away with trying to make you believe that what the Muslims did in Africa is comparable in any way whatsoever to Western colonization. I want to make sure that you don't ever let yourself repeat that slander and that you don't ever cooperate with the West in whitewashing their unparalleled crimes by going along with the lie that Muslims did the same thing that they did, or that in fact anyone ever did the same thing that they did, because no one did. So let's put the whole picture together, everything that we've talked about so far, all of it, side by side, so nobody can pretend that they haven't seen the whole picture. And if you're still going to regurgitate Western anti-Muslim, anti-Arab talking points, if you're going to still regurgitate those deceitful narratives after this, khalas, we'll know that you are not doing it because you have any love for Africa or Africans. You're going to be doing it just exclusively because you hate Islam and because you are a sycophantic collaborator with that sadistic, brutal, and inhuman so-called civilization that terrorized the continent of Africa for centuries. And your own mind is one of the victims. Your own mind is one of the victims of that colonization. So let's talk about the sovereignty issue. Sovereignty under the Muslims, because sovereignty obviously is one of the most basic things that colonization deprives you of. That's exactly what they deprive you of. That's the most fundamental, the most basic element of colonization, is the denial or the deprivation of a people's sovereignty. So for almost 1,200 years, across nearly the entire continent, Muslim Africa ruled itself. Not kind of ruled themselves, not nominally, actually ruled itself. You know, in North Africa, you had just about 150 years under the Khilafah, under Arab administration, which was immediately after the initial ejection of the Byzantine occupation from North Africa. From then on, the next 700, 800 years, no, it was governed by its own African Berber dynasties. You understand? The Rostamids, the Idrisids, the Almoravids, the Almowahids, the Hafsids, and so on. Talking about indigenous rulers, indigenous armies, indigenous law, indigenous power structure. Morocco itself, Morocco never spent a single day even inside of the Ottoman Empire, the whole length of its existence. You understand me? And in sub-Saharan Africa, West Africa, they never answered to anyone outside of themselves. Not once, not for 1 hour, not for 1 minute. Talking about Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Sokoto, Messina, every one of them. Every single one of them. It was built and it was run and it was managed and it was defended by the people who lived there, indigenous African people. Zero Arabs, zero outsiders. And the Swahili coast, they governed their own selves. They governed their own city-states for the whole length of their history. They were trading with the world, the Indian Ocean trade routes and so forth, on their own terms. In the entire sweep of this history, there's exactly one place. There's only one place where an external outside power actually ruled over an African Muslim land, and that's Zanzibar. We haven't talked about Zanzibar yet. That was under Oman for about 150 years or something like that, 160 years. That's the only place that you actually had any African country that was being ruled by an external power, by an Arab power, in the whole history of Islam on the continent. Everywhere else, there was self-rule. African kings, African emirs, African sultans, African rulers, okay? Not Arabs. African scholars, African judges, African courts, and African wealth kept in Africa. You understand me? Now put that next to what actual colonization was, Western colonization. Every single colony on the continent, without exception, was governed from somewhere else, was governed from outside. I mean, yes, the British, they were tricky in some places with their indirect rule system, where they would let a ruler, an indigenous ruler, keep sitting on the throne, while they stood behind him or they stood over him with the actual authority. They had full authority. They had full power to remove that leader the moment he stopped cooperating or stepped out of line. But the French, my goodness, they didn't even bother with the pretense of autonomy. They ruled directly and brutally. They had colonial administrators, they had French law, they created in Algeria a permanent, as I say, second-class citizenship for Algerians that they could only escape by giving up their religion. This was the French. Leopold's Congo, it wasn't even a country, it wasn't even considered a country. It was one man's personal property. The Portuguese in Angola, in Mozambique, they had forced labor as an official state policy. until the 1960s. Okay? You did not have one single indigenous autonomous African government anywhere at any point in the colonial era, in the Western colonial era, that answered to its own people instead of to a foreign capital. Didn't exist. That's the whole system. That's the whole Western system everywhere it touched on the continent. Extraction by design, obedience that was viciously enforced from the outside externally with zero exceptions. Now it's a completely different system. It's a completely different system with completely different outcomes, completely different consequences. Because again, we're talking about a very different people. You understand? We're talking about a so-called civilization that is itself just bizarre in their violence. They're very strange in their violence and their brutality. It's very strange. I said before, when you talk about Western exceptionalism, well, there is one thing. There is one thing that you are truly exceptional about, and that is your violence. You stand out from the rest of humanity for that. You stand out in history because of that, because of your violence. I mean, while Muslim Africa was ruling itself and building itself, Europe was tearing itself apart. They were tearing each other apart to ribbons, you understand? At a scale that would dwarf anything that happened in Africa at that time, or before that time, or up until the colonizers came to Africa. I mean, just look how they were. It's a violent people. If you look at the period when Islam was spreading in Africa, what was going on in Europe at that same time, during that same period? You know, that same period when the so-called evil Muslim invaders, right, were liberating country after country in Africa from 850 years from Christian Byzantine occupation and tyranny. What was happening in Europe when the African Muslims were building empires on the continent? When the African Muslims were building wealth, building civilizations, becoming scholars, founding dynasties, spreading education, organizing indigenous power structures on their own, so on and so on, with no outsider participation whatsoever. What was going on in Europe? In Europe, they were slaughtering each other. They were slaughtering each other. You had just in the 30 Years' War, you had at least 8 million people killed in the 30 Years' War. Then the Napoleonic Wars, that's another 7 million people, upwards of 7 million people killed. Then, of course, you had the Crusades. Not even sure how many were killed in the Crusades. The French wars on religion, the 70 Years' War, the German Peasants' War, the so-called wars of unification and so forth. If you total all of that up, the European total death toll across that whole period of time when Islam was spreading in Africa, you're looking at around 25 to 35 million people killed in Europe between the year of like 700 to the onset of colonization. And what happened in Africa during that time under the evil Muslims during that same 1100, 1200 years period? I'm just talking about in terms of the violence, wars and whatnot. If you count every single named conflict on the continent of Africa, you can find the Al-Muwahid Wars, the Sokoto Jihad, the Masina Jihad, the Adal Ethiopian War, Rabi' al-Zubair's conquest of Bornu, all of it. All of the wars and conflicts on the continent during the Muslim time. The good, the bad, and the ugly. The defensible and the indefensible wars. Because obviously there were conflicts, like I said before. There were conflicts, there were disputes, there were rivalries between indigenous African powers. It wasn't all, rainbows and sunshine. If you took the full death toll from violent conflicts across that 1,300 or 1,200 year history, you're looking at a total of maybe in the hundreds of thousands. If you take the most inflated reading possible, it's going to be in the low millions. Okay? And not one single conflict, obviously, not one single conflict was ever organized around the principle of trying to erase a particular people from the earth. There's no genocides, there's no wanton mass murder, right? Wars and conflicts, yes. Clashes between states, yes. Clashes between empires, yes. Scorched earth, total war, shock and awe, extermination campaigns? Never. Not one. That never happened. Not one time. But now look at the death toll from when those Europeans came to Africa, when colonization came. Now you're talking about a period that's only around 130 years long, only about 130 years, from the late 1800s until the independence movements of the 1960s. Okay? The Congo alone, just the Congo alone, that's just one territory, at least 10 million lives, at least 10 million. That is vastly more, just in the Congo, than the entire death toll for every single Muslim conflict across the whole continent for 11 centuries combined. Let me say that again. You killed more Africans just in the Congo in 2 decades than were killed across the entire continent in over a millennium of Muslim rule. You understand me? Then you add to that Namibia, where 75 to 90% of the entire population was decimated on purpose by written order from the Germans. You had the Maji engineered famine. Up to 300,000 people dead, starved deliberately as a military strategy. You had, obviously, we talked about before, the conquest of Algeria by France. You had the War of Independence together. You're talking about over 1 million, maybe 1.5 million people. You add Kenya, you add Libya's death camps. You add mustard gas dropped from airplanes in Sudan, on and on. We're not talking about warfare that they got worse just because the weapons got better. I know that's what you'll say. We're talking about people using weapons of mass killing, mass destruction, because they were worse people, not because the weapons were better. See, I've talked about this before. You all like to say that the only reason that your death tolls, Western death tolls, are so high, why the numbers of your victims are so much astronomically higher than everyone else's, is just because you had the technology for it and others didn't. Right? This is what you say. But all you do is tell on yourself when you say that. Do you understand? Because Muslims, for example, debated using catapults or not, because they were afraid innocent people might get hurt. The same debate happened with cannons. You understand? The deployment of war technology was an issue of jurisprudence and ethics and morality for us, not for you. For you, it's just about efficiency and logistics. You act like the only reason, you really believe that the only reason that other people didn't kill at the same rate that you killed is because they lacked the technology to do it, not because they lacked the psychopathy to do it. They lacked the complete disregard for human life. You think that the only obstacle that prevented them from being industrial scale murderers was that they lacked industrialization, not that they had a conscience. See, this is what I'm saying. You tell on yourselves. It's very revealing, actually. It's very revealing about your nature and about your character and about your presumptions in your whole framework. You project your sadism and your cruelty on everyone else, as if brutality and ruthlessness are actually human defaults. Like I've said before, you literally think that morality is nothing but a tactic for the weak. No, it's not about the technology. It was never about the technology. It was about the willingness to use the technology, the zeal to use it. It's about the complete dehumanization of other people so that you could actually just shrug off mass slaughter and genocide. We had guns. We had guns before you did. We had cannons. We know how to set a village on fire. We had the technology that you used in order to cut the hands off of people like you did in the Congo. We know how to fill a bottle with boiling hot water and do what you did to a 15-year-old Kenyan girl, but we lacked the savagery. We lacked the sadism. And again, we weren't foreigners. This is very important. We weren't foreigners conquering someone else's land. I have to keep reiterating that because so many of you have got it stuck in your head that when you talk about Muslims in Africa, you actually think that you're not talking about Africans. I don't know how you got this. This is completely delusional. I don't know how you wrap your head around thinking that. Arab administration in Africa was only ever restricted to just 5 North African countries immediately following the ejection of the Byzantines for a very short period of time. And then you had nothing but self-governance for the next 1,000 years, practically. You understand me? There was never Arab rule anywhere else on the continent, like I say, except for Zanzibar, which was only about 150 years out of 1,000. You understand me? No, and there was never any Arab rule in sub-Saharan Africa at all. Not in West Africa, not in East Africa, the Swahili coast, nowhere. Muslim rule in Africa was African rule in Africa. I don't know what you don't understand about that. Muslim Africa governed itself for nearly 1,200 years. And they produced at their worst just a fraction of the conflicts and a fraction of the death toll that Europe produced fighting itself during that same stretch of time on their continent. And then they came, when European colonization came, they stripped every single one of those African governments of their sovereignty. And in 1/9 of the time, they killed at least 12 times more Africans than were killed in conflicts across 11 centuries of Muslim African rule. You understand? A conservative estimate. And we have to estimate. The best we can do is estimate because you didn't take their lives seriously enough to even pay attention to how many of them you killed. But a conservative estimate of how many Africans were killed by the West through conflict is at least 12.5 million people, 12.5 million Africans on the continent in about 130 years. Meanwhile, the total across 30 to 35 conflicts during Muslim rule, during 1,000 years of Muslim rule, in which the conflicts were all intra-African, the total death toll barely even rises even to 1 million in 1,000 years. Even when both sides' casualties were African. Do you understand me? And this is not an opinion. This isn't spin. You understand? This is the arithmetic of colonization versus the arithmetic of sovereignty. So again, is it any wonder? Is it any wonder why they want to make you hate the Muslims? Why they want to make you think that the Muslims so-called conquered and colonized and subjugated Africa, dominated and colonized Africa as some imperial project? Why they want you to hate the Arabs? The Arabs who were barely even there, who were barely even ruling on the continent in just 5 countries for a few decades, 1,000 years ago, who basically only came to drive out the European Christian Byzantine occupation that had been there for 850 years. Of course they want you to hate us. Of course they want you to hate us because they hate you. You understand me? African Muslims gave Africa the longest, the most stable, the most prosperous, the most developed, the most peaceful, the most sovereign civilizations ever produced on the continent in recorded history. Yes, they did. Meanwhile, their so-called civilization, America, Europe, the West, their whole so-called civilization has built itself completely on African subjugation, the vicious one-way extraction of African resources. They rely on it until now. They don't want to see Africa free. Of course not. They don't want to see Africa independent. Of course not. They don't want to see Africa sovereign. Of course not. They don't want to see Africa become what it was before colonization, before colonizers came and terrorized the whole continent and bled it dry. They don't want to see Africa become what the African Muslims made it for 1,000 years. So they want to turn you against us because they are against you. You understand me? You say Arabs colonized Africa, the Muslims colonized Africa. Well, I'm asking, who told you? I mean, really, who told you? And is that who told you, is that who trustworthy? Are they known for their honesty? Do they tell the truth about you? You think they're telling the truth about us? Do they tell the truth about you? Do they tell the truth about themselves and their history? Have they established in the past that they care about you and your best interests? No, you need to scrutinize that. You need to scrutinize that because you might just be listening to people who've never done anything but lie to you. You might just be listening to people who've never done anything but lie to you, who've never done anything but lie about you, and who've never done anything but lie about themselves. You understand me? You might be listening to people who have a vested interest in sowing division and sowing suspicion and sowing hatred between you and your friends. You might be listening to people who have never been anything but your enemy. You understand me? And they're being an enemy to you right now by trying to convince you that your brothers and sisters and your friends are actually your enemies. They're trying to make you believe that the people that they colonized you. You understand? They want you to hate all of the Africans who built 700, 800, 900 years of African sovereignty because they were Muslims. So they want you to believe that they were Arabs. They don't want you to believe that they were Africans. That all those empires, that all those scholars, all those rulers, all those leaders, all that civilization wasn't actually African. You might be listening to the same people who never did anything but tell you that Africa was a jungle, uncivilized, who've never done anything but deny African accomplishment. You understand? They might be the same people who taught you that African people were savages, that they never accomplished or achieved anything. And now they want to get you to disavow and to resent those centuries of African Muslim civilization by making you think that the strongest and the most prosperous period in African history was actually victimization under the Arabs. You might be listening to the same people that taught you that Africa has only ever been victims and that Africans have only ever been victimized, because they don't want you to ever think about yourselves in any way except for the way that they want to think about you. They need you to think about yourself the same way that they see you. Or if you're in the black diaspora in America, you might be listening to one of those American religious cults that uses the Islamic terminology, but also happens to believe that there was a prophet who came from Georgia and who thinks that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala came down in the form of a man. And so they want to estrange you from the Arabs. They want to estrange you from the African Muslims because they want to estrange you from true Islam. Because I'll tell you what, I've seen comments here and there on some of the videos in this series, some of the other videos in this series. People copying and pasting whatever they got off of Wikipedia, you know, talking about slavery, talking about castration, talking about whatever Kafir concocted Western narrative that they can find, the Zanj slave revolt, this and that, any little snippet that they can get a hold of by Googling Muslim conquest in Africa, you know. And don't worry, we're going to cover all of that. All of those things I'm going to talk about, inshallah, bi'idhnillah. But listen to me, all you're doing is actually announcing to the world that you have no real interest in Africa. You have no real interest in history and certainly no interest in the truth. You are completely driven and exclusively driven by an irrational and implanted hatred of Islam, hatred of Muslims, hatred of Arabs, And so you'll just reach for anything that you think is going to be some kind of a mic drop quote or a gotcha factoid, as if repeating colonizer narratives is how you're going to debunk our debunking of colonizer narratives. SubhanAllah. Like you show me something that's blue, right? And you tell me that that blue thing is red. And then I explain to you, no, it's blue. And you say, well, what about the fact that it's red, though? This is your argument, just to repeat the lie, which just shows what side you're on. And it's not the side of the truth. It's the side of the colonizers. It's the side of the West. It means that you are on the side of the people who are not on your side, which means already your brain isn't working properly. Listen, my channel has gotten throttled since I started this series. Absolutely throttled. I mean, we've been algorithmically suppressed before, but it's never been this bad. This is the worst time that it's ever been in the history of the channel, which just shows you how important it is to the West to prevent you from knowing the truth about Islam in Africa and Muslim achievement in Africa. They'll suppress this. They'll suppress this. Listen to me. Even more than they'll suppress anti-Zionist content, because it's actually more important to them for you to be anti-Muslim than it is for you to be pro-Israel. That matters more to them, specifically if you're African or if you're in the black diaspora in the West. And I get the message. I get the message that the algorithm is telling me they want me to change the subject. They want me to change the subject. Drop it. But see, I have a problem. I have an allergic reaction to inaccuracy and lies, so I don't care. I don't care. You can suppress Middle Nation. You can prevent people from seeing this channel. I don't mind at all. All we're doing here is bearing witness. Like I've said many times, that's all we're doing. We're not doing this for views. We're not doing this for clicks and likes and shares or what have you. We're doing it because we have a duty to tell the truth. That's all. Like I've said many times, we're not doing it for popularity. We're doing it for posterity. And the truth of the matter is that our African brothers and sisters in Islam built and accomplished and fought and struggled and achieved in Africa. And they gave our ummah in Africa absolutely brilliant civilizations. And those civilizations deserve to be honored. They deserve to be respected. They deserve to be remembered proudly for what they were and not erased out of history as the shining examples that they were, the shining examples of sovereignty and achievement. By making people either think that those things never happened at all, or making people think that someone else did it, that the Arabs did it, and that it wasn't just done by the Arabs in Africa, but it was done to Africans. Instead of being for the liberation and the upliftment of Africa, they want to make you think that it was being done all at the expense of Africa, when that was actually the period in African history when they had the most sovereignty and the most success and the most victory. So of course they want to confuse things, they want to distort things, and they want to turn you against the people who helped you the most. And I'm not even talking about other people. I'm talking about African people. African Muslims achieved this. And they want to take all of that away from African Muslims by pretending that African Muslims aren't African, that it was Arabs who did it to Africa instead of African Muslims who did it for themselves.